The cold hit her before she even opened her eyes. It was the kind of cold that pressed itself into bone, that made a person aware of every place their body touched the earth. Serafina Vale lay on her back, with her arms at her sides, and her white hair spread around her head like frost on a window. And the first thing she understood, before she understood anything else, was that she was still alive. She had not expected that. Her eyes opened to a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that had not yet decided whether to release their snow. The trees around her were tall and dark, bark stripped smooth by decades of wind, branches locked together overhead in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost like they had been arranged to frame the sky above her. She had never seen trees like these. She had never been this far from the Ashvale Pack's territory in her life. She tried to sit up. Pain moved through her ribs like something being tightened with a wrench. She pressed her teeth together and breathed through it, slow and measured, the way she had learned to breathe through pain years ago, when she was young enough to cry about it, and old enough to understand that crying changed nothing. She got one elbow under her, then the other. Then she was upright, her white hair falling across one shoulder, her hands pressed flat against the cold ground. She took in the clearing around her. Grass, dark soil, a ring of those tall, smooth-barked trees in every direction, and beyond the tree line, sound. Not wind, not rain, something low and present, a hum that did not have a source she could identify, that seemed to come from the ground itself, rather than from any creature or object she could see. Serafina had been born with better hearing than most. It was one of the few things about herself she had never been able to dislike, even on the days when everything else about her felt like an apology. She could hear water running underground. She could hear conversations 3 rooms away. She could hear the specific silence that came before something important was about to happen. She heard that silence now. She got to her feet. Her knees were wrong, shaky in a way that made her feel older than 22, and her ankles had no real confidence in themselves. But she stood. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every angle of the clearing, every place the tree line interrupted itself, every shadow that moved when it should not have moved. She did not see anyone. She felt them anyway. This was not a skill she had cultivated. It was something she had developed the way plants in dark rooms develop, by reaching toward whatever light existed, by adapting to the specific conditions of her environment. The environment of her entire life had been the Ashvale Pack, where danger was rarely announced, and was most dangerous when it pretended to be something else. She had learned to read a room without looking at it. She had learned to know when she was being watched. She was being watched now. "Hello?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. This was another skill from Ashvale, appearing more certain than she was, because uncertainty was something that certain wolves in that pack had treated as an invitation. No answer. The low hum continued. The clouds continued their slow deliberation about snow. A single dry leaf fell from somewhere above her and drifted past her field of vision and landed without sound in the grass near her left foot. She looked down at the leaf, and then she looked up, because the sound had changed. It was not louder. It was more present. The difference between a sound that exists at a distance and a sound that exists in the same room as you. Something had moved. Multiple somethings, moving with the specific coordination of creatures that did not need to communicate the plan, because they already knew it. The first wolf stepped out of the tree line to her left. She had seen wolves before. The Ashvale Pack had wolves who shifted during training runs, during territory patrols, during the ceremonial events that the pack leadership organized 3 times a year, and that Serafina had attended exactly once, before being told her presence made the events feel unbalanced. She knew what a large wolf looked like. This wolf was larger than large, in the way that certain things exceed their category entirely, and require a new one. Dark brown, almost black, with a broad chest and paws that pressed into the grass with unhurried certainty. Its eyes were amber. It looked at her with an attention that was not the attention of an animal deciding whether something was prey. It was the attention of something assessing. She stayed still. She had learned that too, in Ashvale. Stay still when you do not know what is about to happen. Movement announces panic, and panic announces weakness, and weakness in certain environments is the worst thing you can advertise. Another wolf, to her right. This one gray, almost silver, with a long, narrow face, and eyes the color of cold water. Then another, and another. They came out of the tree line in 1s and 2s, not rushing, not circling with the tense energy of hunters working a target. They simply arrived. They placed themselves in a loose ring around the clearing, each one finding a position and settling into it with the relaxed deliberateness of creatures carrying out a decision already made. Serafina counted 12 wolves, arranged in a circle around her, and not one of them making a sound. She turned again, slowly, looking at each one. She was looking for aggression, tucked ears, raised hackles, the lowered head that preceded a charge. She did not find it. What she found instead was harder to categorize, and therefore more frightening, because unfamiliar things are always more frightening than familiar ones, even when the familiar thing is bad. What she found was calm. These wolves were completely, deeply calm. They watched her with an attention that felt almost respectful, which made no sense at all, because she was an omega from a pack that treated her like furniture, and she was standing in a clearing she could not name, surrounded by 12 enormous wolves, who should by every reasonable measure have been threatening her, and they were not. They were just watching. She pressed her hands against her thighs to keep them from shaking, and she looked toward the gap in the tree line directly in front of her, the one that seemed slightly wider than the others, the one through which no wolf had yet appeared. And then that changed. He came through the gap without hurrying, the way someone enters a room they own, the way someone moves, when the concept of needing to announce themselves has simply never applied to them. He was in his human form, which was the first thing she registered, and then she registered everything else in quick succession, and in no particular order, because her brain was doing that thing where too much information arrives at once, and the processing gets tangled. He was tall. Not in the way that some men are tall and you think they must find door frames difficult. Tall in the way that makes a person seem like they occupy slightly more of the world than the average human being is allocated. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, longer at the top, and he wore clothes that were plain and dark, and did not try to be anything other than practical. His face was... She reached for a description and found her vocabulary briefly unhelpful, which irritated her, because she read constantly and had strong opinions about language and did not appreciate the times when it failed her. His face was the kind that made a person want to look at it again, immediately after looking at it the first time, not because it was performing anything, because it was completely, disconcertingly still. He looked at her the way the wolves looked at her. With that same calm, that same assessed certainty. "You are inside the Blackmore border," he said. His voice was unhurried, even, with a quality like something solid, like the kind of voice that is never needed to be louder than necessary, because the room always goes quiet when it speaks. Serafina opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I did not know that," she said. He nodded, as if this were a reasonable and expected answer, which somehow made it worse. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She thought about this, which was the wrong thing to do, because it made her aware of her ribs again, and her knees, and the general condition of her body, which had spent the night in a forest in November. "A little," she said. "Nothing that will not heal." He looked at her for another moment. The 12 wolves around her had not moved. The sky had still not decided about its snow. A second leaf fell from somewhere above, and drifted past her in the same direction as the first, as though leaves had a preferred route. "I am Kalen Morrow," he said. "This is Blackmore territory. You will be given food, warmth, and a place to rest, while we determine what brought you here, and what you need." Serafina stared at him. "I do not need anything from you," she said, because this was the reflex she had developed over 22 years, of living in a pack that offered things, and then collected the debt at the worst possible moment. He did not look offended. He did not look amused. He looked at her with the same calm attention and said simply, "That may be. But you are on my land, you are injured, and it is November. Come inside." She thought about arguing. She was capable of excellent arguments. She had conducted several very good arguments in her life, mostly internal ones, in situations where arguing out loud would have resulted in consequences she did not want. She assembled one now, in the space of about 4 seconds, and then looked at the 12 wolves still sitting in their calm circle around her, and then looked at the sky, which was now making its decision about snow and arriving at a definitive yes, and then looked at the man named Kalen Morrow, who was already turning back toward the gap in the tree line. He did not look back to see if she was following. That was somehow the thing that made her follow. because every person in her life who had wanted something from her had watched to make sure she was doing what she was supposed to do. They had tracked her, monitored her, made sure she was staying in the box they had decided she belonged in. Kalen Morrow turned his back on her and walked, and the confidence in that gesture was not the confidence of someone who knew she had no other option. It was the confidence of someone who had already respected her right to choose. She did not know what to do with that, so she walked after him. The snow began to fall, soft and directionless, as she crossed the clearing and stepped through the gap in the tree line into whatever came next. To understand how Serafina Vale ended up in that clearing, in that forest, on that particular November morning, you had to go back to a birth that nobody in the Ashvale pack had been glad to witness. She had been born during a storm, which the older members of the pack remembered and attributed meaning to later, after the fact, in the way people attach significance to things once those things have become stories worth telling. The storm itself was unremarkable. It rained often in that region in October, and the rain had been heavier than usual but not memorably so, and the only truly unusual thing about the night of Serafina's birth was what she looked like when she arrived. White, completely white, not the white of very pale skin, not the white of very light hair, but the white of something made deliberately without color, as though whoever or whatever had assembled her had looked at the usual selection of browns and blacks and warmer shades and set them aside. Her hair was white. Her eyebrows were white. Her eyelashes were white so fine and light they were barely visible. Her skin was the particular color that skin becomes when it contains no pigment. Not quite pink, not quite silver, but something between the two that changed depending on the light. Her eyes were the palest possible version of blue, almost colorless, and in certain lights they looked as though they were made of glass. Her mother had looked at her once and then closed her eyes. Serafina did not know this. She had been told nothing about her mother, whose name she had eventually learned was Clara, and who had lived only long enough to understand that the child she had produced was not what anyone had wanted. The story the pack told was that Clara had been too weak, that the birth had been difficult, that these things happened. Serafina had grown up without asking questions about her mother because she had quickly learned that questions about her own origins were the kind of questions that made certain people in the pack look at her with something cold in their eyes. So she had stopped asking. Her father, a mid-ranking male named Gordon, had done what certain people do when they encounter something they do not want to be responsible for. He had found the nearest available alternative. In the Ashvale pack, the alternative for an unwanted Omega pup was the communal den, a set of rooms at the edge of the pack's main building, where young Omegas lived collectively, under the supervision of an older female named Hester, who was not unkind, but was also not warm, and who managed the children in her care the way a person manages a task rather than a relationship. Serafina had lived in the communal den for 16 years. She had learned, in those 16 years, a very specific set of skills that nobody had intended to teach her. She had learned how to be invisible in a room, which was different from being unnoticed. Invisible was active. It required attention and adjustment. It required watching other people and positioning herself in relation to them so that her presence did not create friction. She had learned how to complete work before she was asked to complete it, because being ahead of the request meant less contact, less supervision, less opportunity for anyone to find fault. She had learned how to read the energy of a room from the doorway before entering it, so that she knew what she was walking into and could prepare herself accordingly. These were survival skills. They looked, from the outside, like conscientiousness. From the inside, they felt like armor. She was good at school, in the Ashvale pack's version of schooling, which was practical, and not particularly interested in the kinds of questions Serafina found most interesting. She read everything she could find, which was not as much as she would have liked but was enough to give her an interior life that was significantly larger and more interesting than her exterior one. She had opinions about books. She had theories about history. She had thoughts about language and the way words worked, the way certain combinations of words produced feelings that the individual words did not produce on their own. She shared none of this with anyone in the Ashvale pack, because she had tried, once, when she was around 13, and the response had been a specific kind of contempt that she had not forgotten. The girl she had tried to share her thoughts with, an Omega named Paula, a year older than her, had looked at her with something between pity and amusement and said, "Who do you think you are?" It was a good question. Serafina had spent a long time trying to figure out the answer. The pack's ranking system made the answer seem obvious. She was an Omega, which in Ashvale meant she was at the bottom of everything. The hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of resources, the hierarchy of consideration. Omegas in Ashvale were not without purpose. They filled the roles that needed filling, the cleaning and the cooking and the child care, and the administrative tasks that kept the pack functioning. But purpose was not the same as value, and being needed for something was not the same as being wanted. The albino designation made everything worse. There were no other albino wolves in Ashvale, and there had not been in living memory, and the pack's collective attitude toward things it did not have a framework for was to treat them as suspicious. She had been called an omen so many times, by so many different people, that she had once looked up the word in a dictionary to understand what exactly she was supposed to be predicting, and had found that omens could be good or bad depending on interpretation, and had allowed herself, privately, the small thought that perhaps she was a good omen, and everyone around her was just interpreting it wrong. She held on to that thought. It was a small thing. She held on to it the way a person holds on to a small warm object in cold weather, not because it solves the problem of the cold, but because it is better than nothing. She turned 18 and left the communal den. She had been given a room of her own, small and on the ground floor near the service entrance, with a window that looked onto a wall rather than the courtyard. She found ways to make it hers. She found plants that did well in low light, and she grew them on the windowsill. She organized her books in a system that made sense only to her, and that she found satisfying every time she looked at it. She turned 20, and nothing changed except that she had been doing the same work for 4 more years, and had gotten more efficient at it, and the efficiency had been noted by exactly no one. She turned 21, and a beta male named Philip decided that she had looked at him with too much confidence in a corridor, and had told Hester, his aunt, and Hester had told the pack leadership, and the pack leadership had given Serafina a formal warning about behavior unbecoming to her rank. She had stood in the leadership office and received this warning with her hands folded and her face very still, and had said she understood, and had walked back to her small room near the service entrance, and had sat on her bed and stared at the wall for a long time. She had not cried. She had considered it. She had decided against it, not because she thought crying was wrong, but because she had run out of a certain kind of feeling. You could only be surprised by unfairness so many times before the surprise wore off, and what was left was something quieter and colder, and in some ways more useful. She had gotten very quiet and very cold that night, and she had started, slowly and carefully, to make a plan. It was not a dramatic plan. It was not a plan born of rage or rebellion or a sudden revelation. It was a plan born of arithmetic, the simple calculation of a person who has looked at their current situation from every angle and determined that every angle produces the same result, and that the result is not survivable in the long term. She was going to leave the Ashvale pack. She did not know where she was going. She had very little money, saved in small amounts over years from the modest allocation given to Omegas for personal expenses. She had her books, some of which she would have to leave behind because they were too heavy to carry. She had her plants, which she could not take at all, and this cost her more than she expected. She spent 3 months planning. She studied maps. She learned what she could about the territories that bordered Ashvale, which packs occupied which lands, which borders were patrolled and at what intervals, which routes through the forest would give her the best chance of moving without being detected. She left on a November night, when the moon was minimal and the patrol schedule was on its predictable rotation. She got farther than she expected. She went in the direction she had planned. She covered ground steadily, because she had always been a good walker, better than most people expected from someone they thought of as fragile. And then something happened that had not been in the plan. She felt something pull. Not a sound, not a smell, not any of the sensory signals she had been tracking to navigate, something else. A sensation she had no accurate word for, like a thread somewhere behind her sternum, that someone had gently taken hold of, and was drawing in a direction she had not been traveling. She stopped. She stood in the dark forest, and she pressed her hand to her chest, and she waited for the sensation to pass, because it was clearly some product of exhaustion, and cold, and the stress of the night, and it would pass. It did not pass. It got stronger. She told herself, firmly, that she was not going to follow a feeling she could not name into an unfamiliar forest at night. She was a practical person. She valued evidence. She did not make decisions based on sensations she could not explain. She followed the feeling. She could not explain this then, and could not fully explain it later. What she could say, when she was eventually able to talk about that night with any honesty, was that the feeling was not frightening. Every frightening thing she had ever experienced in her life had carried a quality of wrongness, a sense of something being off, something pushing against her. This feeling had the opposite quality. It felt, irrational as this was, like something settling into a correct position. Like a key in a lock. She walked. The night got colder. The terrain changed, the familiar flat ground of Ashvale's border forest giving way to something hillier, rockier, with undergrowth that was thicker and more varied. She had crossed a boundary at some point. She knew this without being able to identify exactly when it happened. She was deep inside unfamiliar territory when her body finally made the decision her mind had been resisting. Her legs gave out, not from injury, not from any single moment of failure, but from the accumulated expense of a night of cold and effort and emotional weight, all of it landing at once with a completeness that left her no argument. She sat down in the grass of a clearing she could not see clearly in the dark, and she thought, I will rest for a moment. She was asleep in under a minute. She slept through the dark, and through the earliest gray of dawn, and through the moment when something came to the edge of the clearing and stopped, and then more somethings came, and they arranged themselves in a careful ring, and they did not move, and they did not make a sound. They only watched, and they waited for her to wake up. The Blackmore compound was nothing like what she had expected, which was partly because she had not had a clear expectation, and partly because whatever vague assumption she might have formed about the most feared pack on the continent would not have included this. She had expected something that matched the reputation. Iron gates, perhaps. Guards at every threshold. An architecture that announced its own seriousness the way certain buildings do, with narrow windows and walls that seemed to lean inward with the weight of what they contained. She had expected to feel the power of the place before she saw it, the way you feel a change in weather pressure before the storm arrives. What she walked into, following Kaylin Morrow through the tree line and across a wide, frost-covered field and through a gate that stood open rather than closed, was a compound that looked inhabited in the way a family home looks inhabited, full of evidence of daily life. A courtyard with a fire burning in its stone pit. 2 children running across the far end with a dog of some medium enthusiastic breed at their heels. A woman in a heavy coat carrying a bundle of firewood, with the particular stride of someone who has carried firewood many times and has developed efficient opinions about it. Serafina slowed down. Kaylin, 3 steps ahead of her, noticed. He turned, not with impatience, but with the attention of someone who was genuinely tracking her state, rather than performing the act of tracking it. It is a working compound, he said, not a showpiece. I see that, she said. He waited. She started walking again. She was aware of being looked at as she crossed the courtyard, not the way she was used to being looked at in Ashvale, which was the look of people deciding how much consideration she deserved and landing reliably on a number lower than 0. This was something different, curious, not unfriendly. Several people they passed made a gesture she did not recognize, a slight incline of the head, not quite a bow, more like an acknowledgement. None of them directed it at her. They directed it at Kaylin, and then their eyes moved to her, and the looks she received from them contained something she could not name, but that did not make her want to make herself smaller. She catalogued this, stored it, did not know what to do with it yet. Kaylin led her inside the main building. A corridor, wide and warm, with stone floors and high ceilings, and the kind of lighting that came from enough windows, rather than from an attempt to compensate for a lack of them. He stopped at a door midway along the corridor and opened it. This room is yours, he said. She looked into the room. It was larger than her room at Ashvale, significantly larger. A bed with a frame of dark wood and blankets that looked thick and real, rather than thin and practical. A window that looked out over the courtyard, which meant actual light and actual sky, rather than a wall. A desk, a wardrobe, a door in the back wall that, when she stepped inside and approached it, turned out to lead to a private washroom with a bath, a detail her mind registered and then refused to process immediately, because it was too outside her existing framework. There are clothes in the wardrobe, Kaylin said from the doorway. They will not all fit correctly, but there is enough to be comfortable, while we find better. Food will be brought in an hour. If you need anything before then, you can ask anyone in the corridor." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, not crossing its threshold, not entering the space he had given her without invitation. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Why what? Why any of this?" She gestured at the room, at the wardrobe, at the window and its view. "You do not know me. I appeared in your forest. You have no reason to." "There are things I need to explain to you," he said. "I would like to do that once you are warm and rested and fed. Not before. You cannot listen well when you are cold." She stared at him. "That is actually true," she said, because it was, and she found she could not argue with something that was simply correct. "I know," he said. There was something brief in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, something lighter than either. He stepped back from the doorway. "Rest. Eat. I will come to you this evening, if you are willing," she said. "I will think about it." He nodded, as though this were a perfectly acceptable answer, and he left, and the door closed quietly behind him. Serafina stood in the middle of a room that was more than she had been given in years, and looked at the closed door, and waited for the other shoe to drop, for the feeling of debt to arrive, for the internal alarm that had been trained to fire whenever something good appeared, because something good in Ashvale always had a hidden cost attached to it, always came with conditions written in small print that you only found when it was already too late to refuse the terms. The alarm did not fire. She did not know what to do with that either. She went to the washroom and found hot water that ran without being coaxed, and she stood under it for a very long time. She found the clothes in the wardrobe, and he had been right. They were not a perfect fit. They were slightly large in the shoulders and slightly long in the sleeves, the practical clothes of someone significantly bigger than her, but they were warm and clean, and she put them on, and sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for the world to clarify itself. It did not clarify itself in time. She fell asleep before the food arrived. She woke to a knock on the door and a tray on the small table beside it, left by someone who had come in and out without waking her, which told her something about how deeply she had been asleep, and also something about how quietly people in this place moved. She ate. The food was plain and substantial. Bread and stew and something warm to drink that tasted of herbs she could not fully identify. She ate all of it, and was surprised to find herself still seated at the table afterwards, not because she was not done, but because she was not used to eating until she was actually finished. In Ashvale, meals were timed events with a specific window, and the window for omegas opened after others had gone and closed before she was usually ready. She had spent years eating quickly, learning to stop before she felt done, training her body to accept less than it wanted. She sat at the table in this room in Blackmore and ate until she was genuinely finished, and then she put down the spoon and sat with the strangeness of that. When Kalen knocked that evening, she answered the door. He had a second chair with him, which he had apparently carried from somewhere, because the room had only one. He set it across from the existing chair, near the window where the evening light was still coming through, and he sat down in the second one, and looked at her with that steady attention that she was beginning, cautiously, to categorize. It was not the attention of someone who wanted something from her that she could name. It was not the attention of someone who was managing her, or tracking her for the purpose of control. It was the attention of someone who was genuinely taking her in, the specific, irreplaceable her, and finding it worth the time. She sat in the first chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "You said there were things you needed to explain." "Yes," he said. "Then explain them." He did not hedge or preamble. She had noticed this about him already, in their short acquaintance. He seemed to have made a decision at some point in his life that preamble was a waste of both parties' time, and he had organized his communication accordingly. She found she respected this. "In Blackmore," he said, "the Alpha King does not choose a mate by arrangement, or by family alliance, or by any of the traditional methods your pack or other packs use. There is a bond that forms. It forms once, for a specific person, and it cannot be transferred or reassigned." She looked at him. "I have heard of this," she said, slowly, because she had read about it. Mate bonds were discussed in some of the older texts she had found in Ashvale's small, neglected library. They had seemed like history, like something from a time when the rules of the world were different. "It is not history," he said, as though he had followed her thought exactly. "It is a real thing, and it formed, for me, 3 years ago." She waited. The bond identified you, he said, by name, by location, by everything about you that makes you distinct from every other person in the world. It has been telling me, for 3 years, that you are the person I am meant to be paired with. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was moving from gray to the particular dark blue that comes just before actual night. Someone was walking across the courtyard below, their footsteps audible on the frost-hardened ground. A door opened somewhere in the building and released a brief wash of warmth and voices, and then closed again. Serafina sat in her chair and looked at the man across from her. She said, and then stopped. He waited. You have known this for 3 years, she said. Yes. And you did not come to Ashvale? No. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not have an answer, she thought, but because he was choosing the most accurate version of it. Because arriving at your pack, as what I am, with what I would have been claiming, would have created a situation where you had no choice. The pack leadership would have deferred to me. Your own wishes would have been secondary to the politics of the situation. I did not want that. She looked at him for a long time. But I am here now, she said. You came here yourself, he said. That matters. She did not know how to answer this. She was 22 years old, and she had spent her entire life in an environment where her wishes were secondary to the situation, where her presence or absence was arranged by other people, for reasons that had nothing to do with what she wanted. She had learned to treat her own preferences as a private matter, something to be maintained internally, but not expected to influence anything external. The idea that her arrival here, on her own terms, in her own time, mattered to him, that he had specifically arranged things so that she could arrive on her own terms, landed somewhere inside her that was not used to receiving things like that. She felt it land. She did not know what to do with it. She filed it away to think about later, when she was alone, which was what she did with things that were too large to process in front of another person. What are you telling me this for? She said. What do you want from me? Nothing right now, he said. I am telling you so that you understand the context. You are here, and there is a reason for that, even if it does not feel that way yet, and you deserve to know the reason, rather than finding out later and feeling deceived. She thought about this. What happens now? She said. You stay, he said, as a guest, with full guest rights, which in Blackmore are significant. You have this room. You have access to the compound and its library and its spaces. You are not asked to do anything. You are not required to decide anything. You can leave at any time, and nobody will stop you. She searched his face for the condition, for the part of this that would turn out to be the fine print. What if I decide to refuse the bond? She said, what if I stay here and decide, eventually, that I do not want this? Then you will not want it, he said. The bond is not a trap. You cannot be held in it against your will. It does not work that way. She stared at him. That is not what the stories say, she said. She had read enough to know that mate bonds in fiction, and in the accounts told by older pack members, were usually framed as something irresistible, something that took a person over, that removed the question of choice from the equation entirely. The stories are told by people who find it more convenient to believe that choice was never part of the equation, he said, simply. It always was. The dark blue outside the window had deepened to the actual black of a November night. The courtyard below was quiet. Serafina sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at a man who had waited 3 years without announcing himself, who had given her a room with a view and a wardrobe of clothes and a meal that he had made sure arrived while she was sleeping so that she could not refuse it, and who was now sitting across from her, telling her she could leave whenever she wanted. She had no framework for this. It did not fit any category she had developed over 22 years, of learning how the world worked and what people wanted from her, and how much of herself she had to withhold to keep herself safe. She needed a new category. She was not sure she knew how to make one. I need time, she said. I know, he said. I am not saying yes. I am not asking you to. She looked at him one more time. He looked back. Neither of them looked away, which was the first time in Serafina's memory that she had held eye contact with someone of his rank without feeling the specific anxiety of a person doing something she was not supposed to do. Good night, she said. Good night, he said, and stood, and took his chair, and left. She sat alone in the room for a long time after he was gone. She had come to this territory by accident, pulled by something she still could not explain. She had woken surrounded by wolves, and walked into a compound that was not what she expected, and eaten food that was given without conditions, and been told, by the most powerful man in 7 packs, that he had known about her for 3 years, and had specifically arranged circumstances so that she would have a choice. She was not naive enough to simply believe all of this. But she was not so defended, so entirely armored, that she could dismiss it either. She would watch. She would pay attention. She would stay alert. She would not let herself be swept away by the novelty of being treated well, because novelty was not the same as reliability, and she had learned the difference between the two the hard way. But she would stay, for now, because she had nowhere else to go that was better than this, and because somewhere inside her, in the place where she had spent 22 years, maintaining a very small, careful light that she refused to let go out entirely, something had shifted very slightly. Not hope, too early for that. The thing that comes just before hope, when the conditions that make hope possible first become visible. She went to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard, and the frost on the stones, and the last few embers in the fire pit, and she let herself feel it, that not quite hope, for exactly a moment. Then she went to bed. Outside, the first real snow of November arrived, and began to cover everything quietly and thoroughly, and somewhere in the building, in a room she had not yet located, Kalen Morrow sat at his desk and wrote nothing, and thought carefully about everything, and waited. Her name in Blackmore, within the first week, became a small and interesting problem. Not because anyone said it wrong. They said it carefully, in fact. Serafina, 4 syllables, with the emphasis on the second one, delivered with the particular attention of people who have been told something matters, and have decided to take that instruction seriously. The problem was that no one seemed uncertain what to do with her. In Ashevale, her arrival in any room had produced a specific atmospheric shift, a slight lowering of warmth, a reorientation of posture among the people present that communicated, without words, that she was a quantity that did not belong in whatever equation was currently being worked out. In Blackmore, she arrived in rooms and people said good morning. She found this deeply unsettling. The first person who had a real conversation with her was Petra Cole. Petra was tall and broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that looked as though it had been hit at some point in the past, and had decided, upon reflection, that it was fine. She was one of Blackmore's senior warriors, which Serafina learned not from Petra herself, but from a passing remark someone else made in the corridor. Petra had not mentioned her own rank. She had appeared on the 3rd morning, outside Serafina's door, with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested she had been given a job, and was going to do it efficiently. "You have been staying in your room," Petra said, handing Serafina the tea. Serafina took it. "I have been reading." "There is a library," Petra said. 3 floors, better selection than whatever you have found in there. "I have been using the books I brought with me." "Then you have been hiding in your room." Serafina looked at her. Petra looked back with the direct, unornamented attention of someone who did not invest energy in softening observations that were accurate. Serafina found she could not argue with this. "Yes," she said, "I have been hiding in my room." Petra nodded, satisfied by the honesty. "Come with me." She came. The library was on the north side of the building, occupying 3 floors as promised, with iron staircases that connected the levels and bookshelves built directly into the stone walls, and tall windows that let in the gray morning light and made the whole space feel like the interior of something that had grown, rather than been constructed. Serafina walked in behind Petra and stopped. She had never been in a library like this. The Ashevale Library was a single room with shelving on 2 walls and a narrow table in the center, and a collection that leaned heavily toward pack law and administrative records, with a small and somewhat random selection of other texts that seemed to have arrived over the decades through a process of no particular intention. She had read all of them. She had been through the pack law section twice, and the administrative records once, for completeness, and she had memorized the locations of the few books that actually interested her. This library had entire sections she did not recognize. History, that covered territories she had never heard of. Science that moved beyond the basic biology she had been taught. Philosophy, literature, books written in languages she could partially read, and some she could not read at all. and would have very much liked to. She stood in the entrance and looked at it, and forgot, for a moment, everything else. "There is a system," Petra said, from somewhere behind her. "The archivist will explain it. Her name is Ruth. She will be here this afternoon." "I can find my own way," Serafina said, walking toward the nearest shelf. "I am sure you can," Petra said, and there was a brief quality in her voice that Serafina, without turning around, recognized as the specific sound of a person containing something like amusement. "I will be back at midday. We can walk the compound if you would like." "I may be busy," Serafina said. "You may," Petra agreed, and her footsteps retreated, and Serafina was alone in the library, with more books than she had ever been in a room with, and she spent the next 4 hours in a state of absorption so complete that she missed lunch entirely, and only became aware that she was hungry, when Ruth, the archivist, a small, precise woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a cord around her neck, appeared at her shoulder and said, gently but firmly, that the afternoon light was going, and perhaps it was time to eat something. The routine built itself quietly over the following days. Morning tea with Petra, because Petra continued to bring it, and Serafina found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she looked forward to it. Time in the library. The midday walk, which Petra had simply continued initiating without making it a question, which Serafina had found was the only way to make her actually leave the building. Evenings with a book by the window, or in the library, or sometimes at the desk in her room with paper she had asked Ruth for, writing things she was not sure yet were anything more than herself thinking on paper. She did not see Kalen often. He was present in the compound in the way that someone is present in a house they manage. You sense their influence on things, the decisions that have been made, the way the place functions and what it prioritizes. But he did not insert himself into her days. He had said she needed time, and he had meant it in the operational sense, not just the polite one. She passed him in the corridor 2 or 3 times in the first week, and he acknowledged her with the same calm attention he had given her on the first night, without urgency, without the particular energy of someone waiting for something to happen. She found this more interesting than she wanted to admit to herself. She had experience with people who said one thing, and then behaved in a way that made the saying meaningless. She had a long and detailed personal history, with that specific gap between stated intention and actual behavior. She had become expert at reading it, at finding the moment when the performance of patience became the pressure underneath the performance. She could not find it in Kalen. She tried. She watched him at meals, when they happened to be in the common dining room at the same time. She watched him in the corridors, the way he moved through his own compound, the way his people interacted with him. She watched the faces of the people around him for the things she knew how to read. That specific quality of tension that existed in places where the person in charge was unpredictable, where the calm surface hid something that might shift without warning. She did not find it. What she found instead was something she did not have a word for in her vocabulary, because she had not previously had occasion to use it. The closest word she had was ease. The compound operated with ease. People disagreed with each other in the common spaces, openly, and resolved the disagreements and continued their meals. A junior member of the pack made a mistake in a training session that Serafina watched from a window, dropped someone when the grip failed, a tangle of limbs, and a landing that was not what was planned. And the correction that followed was immediate and instructional and completely without humiliation. Nobody looked at the door to see if the display of imperfection had been witnessed and would be punished. The 10th day she was in Blackmore, something happened that clarified something for her. She was in the library, on the 2nd floor, in the section that she had privately named the Interesting Philosophy section, when she heard voices below her. The library's stone construction created odd acoustics. Conversations on the ground floor sometimes traveled up clearly, sometimes dissolved entirely, depending on where you were standing. She was standing, it turned out, in a place where the conversation below traveled clearly. 2 voices, both male. One she recognized, Rory, a young pack member who had been pointed out to her by Petra as someone who had joined Blackmore 3 years ago, from a smaller pack to the east. The other she did not recognize. What he actually said, Rory was saying. I know what he said. The other voice, flat. It does not mean we have to. It does mean that. That is exactly what it means. A pause. She is an Omega, the second voice said, from Ashvale. She has nothing. She is who she is, Rory said. And you know what Kaelin said. You were in the room. Another pause, longer. I know what he said, the second voice said, with less resistance in it now. Something had shifted. He is not wrong. He is never wrong about this kind of thing. It is only... I know, Rory said. His voice had softened. It takes getting used to. The arrangement we thought things were, and the arrangement things actually are not always the same. But you know him. You know how he does things. A door opened somewhere below. The voices moved, the acoustics shifted, and she lost them. Serafina stood in the philosophy section, with a book in her hands that she was no longer reading, and looked at the shelf in front of her without seeing it. Someone in this compound had a problem with her. This was not surprising. She had arrived without announcement, an Omega from an outside pack, and been given a room and access and the clearly communicated interest of the Alpha King. It would have been strange if no one in the compound had any reaction to that. She had expected something like this. She had expected it to be directed at her, though, not discussed carefully in a library on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about Kaelin saying the words she had not been in the room for. She thought about the thing Rory had said. He is not wrong about this kind of thing. She thought about the careful way things in this compound were handled, the way the training correction had been done, the way disagreements resolved themselves, the way even this conversation, which was essentially one person questioning the king's judgment, had been handled not with suppression, but with reasoning. She had spent 22 years in a place where people who questioned the leadership's decisions did not do it in libraries. They did it in corners, in whispers, with one eye on the nearest exit. She put the book back on the shelf. She went down to the ground floor. The library was empty now. She walked through it slowly, looking at the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of books, the way she did when she was thinking about something she could not yet fully articulate. There was a difference, she was working out, between a place that was good at appearing safe and a place that was genuinely safe. She had lived in the first kind. She had become very good at reading the difference, over years of comparative study, because the study had been necessary for her survival. She had learned to read the wall behind the surface, the structure underneath the presentation. She was reading the structure of this place, and what she was finding, day by day, in small moments and large ones, was that the surface and the interior matched each other. This was new. This was genuinely new, and she was not yet sure what to do with new, but she was a person who had survived by paying careful attention to reality, as it actually was, rather than as she wished it to be, and reality in Blackmore was presenting itself as something consistently different from what she had known. She found Kaelin that evening in the courtyard, alone, feeding the fire in the stone pit. This was, she had noticed, a thing he did, a small, physical, ordinary task in a day presumably full of decisions and responsibilities. She had seen him carry things. She had seen him in the kitchen once, early morning, making his own tea, standing at the counter, in the specific quiet of someone who was not performing domesticity, but was simply doing a thing that needed doing. She sat down on the bench near the fire. He looked at her. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it," he said. "What did you tell your pack about me? Before I came. Before I was here." He looked at the fire for a moment, not to avoid her question, but to give it the consideration it deserved. "I told them the truth," he said. That the bond had formed. That the person it identified was an Omega from Ashvale. That she did not know about any of it, and had not been contacted, and that when she arrived, if she arrived, she was to be treated with the same respect as any significant guest, and that nobody was to make her situation harder than it already was. Were there objections? "Some questions," he said. "Not objections. People here understand that the bond does not make decisions based on rank or family or what is convenient. They have seen it before. They understand what it is. But there are people who find it difficult," she said. He looked at her. His expression was attentive, interested. "You heard something." "I was in the library." "Rory," he said, not a question. "And someone else." "Owen," he said. "He is adjusting. He will get there." She looked at the fire. The snow from the previous days had mostly melted, but the air was cold enough that her breath was visible, and the fire was the right kind of warm. The kind that reached you rather than the kind that just existed near you. "You knew they had questions," she said. "You handled them before they became problems." Yes. How did you know when to address them, and when to leave them alone? He was quiet for a moment. Experience, he said, and knowing the people. Owen has always needed time with new information. Rushing him makes it harder. Letting him work through it makes it easier. Rory knows this, and helps when he can. She looked at this man who had known that someone needed time, and had given it without being asked, who had looked at a situation with a person in it, and adjusted his approach to match the person, rather than demanding the person adjust to match the approach. She had a thought, clear and uncomfortable in its clarity. She said, "You do that with me too." He did not deny it. "Yes. You knew I would need time, and you structured things so that I had it." "Yes." She sat with this. She was not angry about it. That surprised her. In Ashvale, the idea that someone had arranged circumstances around her would have triggered an immediate alertness, a searching for the manipulation underneath the arrangement. Here, looking at this specific man, knowing what she knew of him now after nearly 2 weeks of watching him operate in his own world, she could not find the manipulation. What she could find was something that looked, uncomfortably but undeniably, like consideration. The fire snapped. A log shifted. The cold air moved around them both. "I am still not saying yes," she said. "I know," he said. "But I am also not leaving." He looked at the fire. Something in his face changed very slightly. Not an obvious change. The kind of change that was only visible to someone who had been watching carefully. The particular quality of someone releasing something they had been holding, without being aware they were holding it. "Good," he said. Simple. Quiet. She got up. She went back inside. She walked down the warm corridor and up the stairs and into her room with the view of the courtyard, and she sat at the desk and picked up the paper she had been writing on and read what she had written over the past 10 days. She had been writing, she realized, a map. Not a physical one, a map of this place and the people in it and how they moved and what they valued and how it compared to every other map she had ever made, of every other place she had survived. The maps did not match. She picked up her pen and she kept writing. There was a man in Blackmore named Owen Fletcher, and by the 3rd week of Seraphina's stay, she had formed a fairly complete picture of him from observation alone. He was in his late 20s, sandy-haired, with the kind of face that was pleasant when it was not actively being difficult, which it was more often than not. He was one of Kalen's senior advisors, a position he had held for 5 years, according to a detail Petra had dropped during one of their walks, and he carried the specific pride of someone who had earned a proximity to power and had organized much of his identity around that proximity. He was not cruel. She had watched carefully enough to be certain of that. He was not the kind of person who made others smaller for the enjoyment of it, but he was the kind of person who had a clear picture of how things were supposed to work, and who became uncomfortable when reality did not match the picture, and who expressed that discomfort in ways that were just polite enough to be difficult to object to. He had spoken to her directly, exactly twice in 3 weeks. The first time was in the corridor outside the dining room. He had been coming out as she was going in, and they had nearly collided, and he had stepped back and said, with precision, "My apologies." Not the automatic version of an apology, the version that contained, underneath the correct words, a controlled version of something else, an annotation that said, "We are being careful about this." The second time was in the library. She had been at the large table on the ground floor, with several books open, working through a connection between 2 separate historical accounts that had caught her interest, when he sat down at the same table, at the far end, and opened his own documents. He worked for an hour. She worked. When he stood to leave, he paused. "You read Blackmore history," he said, looking at the books on her side of the table. "I read most things," she said. He looked at the specific texts she had open. His expression moved through something complex. Surprise, reassessment, a thing he then closed before it could become visible. "The Alcott account is incomplete," he said. "There is a more detailed version. 2nd floor, east wall, 3rd shelf from the top. Gray binding." She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left. She went and found the book. He was right. It was more detailed, significantly so, and it answered several of the questions she had been working around. She sat with it for 2 hours and thought about what it meant that Owen Fletcher, who was working out his discomfort with her presence in his own way and at his own pace, had nonetheless told her where to find a better book. People were complicated. This was not a new observation, but she had spent most of her life in an environment where complicated meant that the useful and the harmful were so intertwined that the only safe approach was to treat everything as potentially the latter. Here, complicated seemed to mean something closer to what the word actually described: layers, contradictions, the coexistence of difficulty and generosity in the same person. She tucked the observation away. The library became, in these weeks, the place where she did her real thinking. She had always used books the way some people used physical exercise, as a way of moving through problems, of keeping mental motion going while working out something that resisted direct approach. She moved through Blackmore's collection methodically, beginning with the history sections and working outward, and what she found was not only more extensive than she had expected, but more honest. Ashvale's records had been curated in the way that pack records often were, emphasizing the account of events that made the leadership look competent and the pack look strong. Blackmore's archives contained the complicated version, the failures as well as the victories, the decisions that had not worked out, the periods of difficulty and what had caused them, and what had changed. She found this more trustworthy than the cleaned-up version. Ruth, the archivist, had taken to spending part of her morning at the table near Serafina's preferred reading spot. She was a woman of very few words, but those words were well chosen, and she had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in the company of books and had come to expect from people the same standard of precision that good writing required. She did not tolerate vagueness. She did not waste time. She told Serafina which texts were reliable and which were not, which authors had personal reasons to shade their accounts and in which direction, and she did this without being asked and without apparent awareness that this was a significant thing to do for someone who had arrived 3 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes that had been found for her. One morning, Ruth sat down with her tea and looked at the books Serafina had assembled and said, without preamble, "You are studying governance." Serafina looked at the books. History of Territorial Decisions. Records of the founding of the Blackmore adjacent packs. The Alcott account, now well worn from her handling of it. "I am studying the place I am staying in," she said. Ruth sipped her tea. "Same thing," she said, and opened her own book. Serafina thought about that. In the 4th week, Kalen asked her if she would attend the pack's monthly gathering. Not a formal event, he explained. The word he used was gathering, which she found she appreciated, but a regular occasion when the pack came together to share information, raise concerns, and hear from the leadership about decisions and their reasoning. She said she would attend if she could sit where she chose rather than where she might be placed. He said yes. She sat near the back, beside Petra, in a spot that gave her a clear view of the room without announcing her presence. The gathering was in the compound's largest interior space, a long hall with wide tables and benches that could seat around 200 people, and that was on this particular evening, about 3/4 full. She watched people arrive. She watched how they arranged themselves, who sat near whom, where the clusters of friendship and alliance formed, which spaces were conspicuously left empty near the front. Kalen spoke for about 40 minutes. He reported on a border situation to the northeast, on a resource negotiation with a neighboring pack, on 3 specific decisions the leadership had made, and the reasoning behind each one. He did not use the voice she had heard in his office, the quiet one that contained authority without performing it. He used a version of that voice with more projection, but the same quality of someone who has thought clearly about what they are saying and is prepared to be questioned about it. People did question him. Several people, at different points, raised their hands and asked things or offered different perspectives. He answered the questions directly. He disagreed with 2 of the offered perspectives and explained why, and one of the people he disagreed with pushed back further, and he considered that further pushback and then said he would think about it before the next decision point. Serafina watched this. She had attended one formal gathering in Ashvale's version of this format. She had sat in the back of that room too, and she had watched the leadership speak, and she had watched the room's relationship to that speech, and what she had seen was the specific stillness of people who know that the correct response to what is being said is agreement, and who are producing that agreement, regardless of their actual opinion, because they have calculated the cost of producing a different response and found it too high. The room in Blackmore was not still in that way. It was attentive, but the attention had a different quality. The quality of people who were actually processing what was being said and forming genuine responses to it. The disagreements were not performances of managed dissent, carefully calibrated to stay within acceptable limits. They were actual disagreements, from people who expected that disagreeing was a legitimate thing to do. After the gathering, Petra walked her back toward the corridor that led to her room. They walked quietly for a few minutes, and then Serafina said, "Does that happen every month?" "Every month," Petra said. "Has since before I joined Blackmore." "How long have you been here?" 8 years. "And it has been the same quality the whole time?" "He has always answered the way he answered tonight?" Petra looked at her sidelong. "He has improved. He was very certain of himself when he was younger, in the way young leaders are certain before they have made enough mistakes to understand what certainty costs. He learned." A pause. "He listens better than anyone I have ever worked under. That is not a small thing." "No," Serafina agreed. "It is not." She went to her room and sat at the desk and wrote for a long time. Not about governance this time. About something she had been approaching from the sides for weeks, circling it without going directly at it. The way she circled everything important, until she had enough information to approach it without flinching. She wrote about what it felt like to be in this place. It felt, she wrote, like the ongoing experience of discovering that a thing you had stopped believing existed, actually did. She had stopped believing that safety was a consistent quality, rather than a temporary condition. She had stopped believing that generosity came without subscript. She had stopped believing that authority and trustworthiness could coexist in the same person, because every authority figure in her experience had been trustworthy only in the specific sense of being reliably self-serving. She was looking at evidence that these beliefs were not universal truths. They were the specific product of her specific environment. They were accurate maps of Ashvale. They were inaccurate maps of Blackmore, and continuing to use them here was not caution. It was letting the wrong map tell her where she was. She put down the pen. She looked at what she had written. She picked the pen back up. She wrote, "This does not mean trusting blindly. It means updating the map." She folded the paper and put it in the drawer with the others. Something else happened in the 4th week that she had not expected, and that changed the texture of things in a way she was still working out how to describe. She woke in the middle of a night, not from a sound or a dream, but from the particular alertness that sometimes arrived without announcement. She lay still for a moment, and then got up and went to the window. The courtyard was empty. The fire in the pit was long out, covered in a thin layer of ash. The sky above the compound walls was clear, which was unusual for that time of year, and the stars were visible in a way they rarely were, sharp and numerous, and arranged in the specific pattern she had been able to identify since childhood, the one her mother had never taught her, because her mother had died before she could teach her anything, but that she had learned from a book instead. She stood at the window for a while, looking at the sky. After a while, she became aware that she was not the only one awake. Below, in the courtyard, Kalen was sitting on the bench near the unlit fire pit. He was not doing anything she could see. He was simply sitting in the cold, looking up at the same sky she was looking at, with the particular quality of a person who has gone somewhere to think and has not yet finished the thinking. She almost stepped back from the window. She did not. She watched him for a moment, the dark shape of him against the lighter stone of the courtyard, his breath visible in the cold air, something in his posture that was different from the posture he wore during the day, something quieter, more interior. She had a sudden and unexpected awareness that this was the version of him that was not for the compound, not for the role, not for any of the relationships that required him to be the particular thing he was to everyone else. She did not know why this felt like something she should not have seen. She stepped back from the window. She got back into bed and lay in the dark and thought about a man sitting alone in a cold courtyard in the middle of the night, looking at stars, looking like a person rather than an alpha king. She thought about that for a long time. In the morning, when Petra brought tea, Serafina said, "Tell me about him. Not the official version, the actual version." Petra looked at her over the rim of her own cup. Something in her expression shifted. "That is a large question," she said. "I have time," Serafina said. Petra sat down. She set her cup on the small table by the window. She looked at it for a moment, composing something. "He took the Alpha King role at 24, she said. His father died in a border conflict in the East. There was no gradual transition. He stepped into the largest leadership position in the region, with 1 week's notice, and no specific preparation. because his father had been healthy, and nobody had expected it to be necessary yet. Serafina listened. He made mistakes, Petra said. Serious ones. In the first 2 years, there were 3 decisions that cost lives. Not because he was reckless, because he was young and certain, and he did not yet understand what he did not know. He understood it afterward. She paused. He has never forgotten those 3 decisions. I know this because he speaks of them. Not frequently, but when they are relevant. He does not use them as a story about how he has grown. He uses them as a precise account of what happened and what he would do differently. Serafina looked at the courtyard through the window. He has never mated, she said. Not a question. No, Petra said. The bond formed when he was 26. He is known for 3 years. He told no one outside the senior circle for the first year, not because he was ashamed, but because he did not want the knowledge to create pressure on a situation that required none. A pause. He is not a patient man by nature. Patience is a skill he has developed. You can tell the difference if you watch closely. Serafina thought of the midnight courtyard, the stars, the shape of a man in the cold who was not performing anything for anyone. I watch closely, she said. I know, Petra said, and there was something very close to warmth in her voice, the specific warmth of someone who has been watching and approves of what they have seen. That is one of the things I like about you. Serafina looked at her. You like things about me, she said. She meant it as a simple observation. It came out slightly uncertain around the edges. Petra picked up her tea. You are honest, she said. Careful. You do not try to be more than you are, and you do not settle for being less. You watch before you decide, and when you decide you hold the position, she sipped. These are good qualities in a person. I have not said that to someone new in 8 years. Make of it what you will. Serafina made of it something she stored in the same place as the note about updating the map. She was building something, she understood. Not the same building she had been living in all her life. The one designed around the assumption that the world was a place you survived, by making yourself as unnoticeable as possible. A different one, built on different materials. It was going slowly. She was going slowly. This felt right to her, the right pace for something that needed to be real, rather than just decided upon. Outside, the compound moved through its morning. The dog crossed the courtyard at speed. Someone laughed in a room above her. The fire was being rebuilt in the pit by a pair of older pack members, who worked together with the economy of people who have done the same task, side by side for years. She watched all of it, and she was, she noticed, warm. Not from the fire, which was outside and not yet lit. From something else, something that did not have a clean word yet. She was working on finding one. The letter from Ashvale arrived on a Wednesday in her 5th week at Blackmore. She did not know about it at first. The letter was addressed to Kalen Morrow, Alpha King of Blackmore, with a formality that belonged to official correspondence, and it was delivered through the correct channels and placed on Kalen's desk by his assistant, a quiet young man named Elliot, who handled the compound's administrative correspondence with the focused efficiency of someone who takes careful work seriously. Kalen read it at his desk. He put it down. He sat with it for a moment. Then he went to find Serafina. She was in the library, as usual, on the 2nd floor, in the history section. He appeared at the top of the iron staircase, and she looked up, and something in his expression, not alarm, but a specific kind of controlled attention, made her put the book down. He handed her the letter. She read it. The letter was from the Ashvale Pack leadership, specifically from the Alpha, a man named Bernard Cross, whom Serafina had met twice in her entire life, at pack events she had been permitted to attend, and who had on both occasions looked through her rather than at her. The letter informed Kalen that the Ashvale Pack was aware that one of its members was currently residing within Blackmore's territory, and that the pack wished to be informed of the circumstances of this situation, and that pending that information, the pack reserved its position regarding any arrangements that may have been made. It was the language of leverage. She recognized it. She had spent 22 years in an environment where language was used primarily as a management tool, and this letter was a precise and polished example of the form. She folded the letter and handed it back. "What does that mean for me?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "unless you want it to mean something." She looked at him. "They are framing this as though you are property that requires accounting for," she said. Yes. And you find this incorrect, he said, on every level. She picked the book back up, put it back down, stood. What will you tell them? That you are here as a guest, under my protection, and that Ashvale has no claim on your whereabouts or decisions. He paused. Unless you would like to handle it differently. It is your situation. I am asking you what you want. She stared at him. She had had exactly nobody, in the entire history of her life, ask her what she wanted, in the context of a situation that had official weight. Small things, yes. Petra asking if she wanted tea before she brought it. Kaylin asking if she would attend the gathering. The texture of ordinary consideration. But this was a letter from her former pack, a formal communication with potential consequences, and he was standing in her library, with the letter in his hand, asking what she wanted. She said, "Tell them I am here voluntarily, that I am a guest with full rights, and that any further inquiry should be directed to me." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in that look she was becoming more able to read, a quality of being seen, specifically, that she had no prior experience with, and still found slightly disorienting. "I will tell them that," he said. "And Kaylin," she said. The name came out of her mouth easily, which surprised her slightly. She had been using it for a few days, and still found it occasionally strange in her mouth, not because it was difficult, but because the familiarity of it felt like a claim she was not yet sure she had made. "Make it clear that I am not in need of retrieval." "It will be the first sentence," he said, and something in his expression did the thing it had been doing occasionally. That brief, unperformed shift toward something lighter. He turned and went back down the staircase. She sat back down and did not read for several minutes. The letter was a reminder of something she had been able to, not forget exactly, but put at a comfortable distance in these 5 weeks. Ashvale existed. Bernard Cross existed. The pack that had treated her as an accounting problem rather than a person still existed, less than 2 days' travel from where she was sitting. She had not thought about going back. This was interesting to note. She had been planning to leave Ashvale for over a year before she actually left, and in all those months the planning had been accompanied by a constant low-level awareness of Ashvale as the place she was leaving from, the thing she was orienting away from. She had expected that when she left, the orientation would shift, that she would find herself thinking about Ashvale from wherever she was, measuring the distance, calculating the risk. She was not thinking about Ashvale. She was thinking about Blackmore. She was thinking about the library, and the walks with Petra, and the gathering, and Ruth's precise commentary on the reliability of historical accounts. She was thinking about the midnight courtyard, and the shape of a man looking at stars. She was not oriented away from anything. She was oriented toward something. She noticed this. She sat with it. Then she opened the book and went back to work. The following week, something happened that changed the particular shape of things. There was a young woman in the compound named Clara Bell. She had started using the name to herself before she registered the coincidence of the first name, and when she registered it, she sat with it for a long time, and did not know what it meant, but felt that it meant something. Clara Bell was 17, the youngest of the Blackmore Pack's residents, a girl who had been brought to Blackmore by her older brother when their home pack dissolved 2 years ago. She had the quick, bright energy of a person who processes everything at speed, and the watchful quality of someone who learned young to read a room. She had been hovering at a respectful distance from Serafina for 2 weeks. Serafina was aware of this. She was aware of most things that happened within a certain radius of her. Another skill from Ashvale, that constant peripheral awareness, which had been necessary there, and was still operational here whether she wanted it or not. On a Thursday afternoon in the courtyard, Clara Bell came and sat on the opposite end of the bench from Serafina and said, without building toward it, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Serafina said. "I may not answer." Clara nodded, accepting this. "What is it like?" Serafina looked at her. "What is what like?" "Being. The way you are." Clara's voice was careful, not careless. She was asking with respect, not with the specific carelessness of a person who wants to look at something unusual. Having what you have. Being here, all of it. Serafina thought about this. "Strange," she said. "Mostly strange. Strange good or strange bad? Strange in the way that anything is strange when it is very different from what you have known. The strangeness is not the bad part. The bad part was before. Clara was quiet for a moment. The courtyard sounds moved around them. The dog went past at its habitual speed. I came from a bad place too, Clara said quietly. Not the same as yours. Different, but I know how long it takes before good feels safe. She paused. It took me about a year. I am not saying that to discourage you. I am saying it so you know that someone else got there eventually. Serafina looked at her. 17 years old. Sitting on a bench in a cold courtyard, with the deliberate kindness of someone who understands what another person needs, and offers it simply. Thank you, Serafina said, and she meant it, in the full sense of the phrase, the one that implied genuine debt, not the automatic version. Clara gave her a small smile and got up and went back inside. Serafina sat with the warmth of that for a while. It was also in this period that she began to understand what Kalen's role actually required of him, in a more specific and less abstract way than the monthly gathering had shown her. She had been given freedom to move through the compound, and she used it, not in a systematic way but in the natural way, of someone who walks when she thinks, which meant she had by now covered most of the compound and developed a reasonable map of its spaces. In her wandering she had passed, at various times, through the corridor outside the main meeting room, which appeared to be in fairly constant use. She heard meetings, not the content. She was not trying to listen, and the heavy door muffled most of the substance, but the rhythm and tone of them. She heard the tone of negotiation, the particular cadence of competing positions being worked toward resolution. She heard, on one occasion, Kalen's voice raised in a way she had not heard before, not heated, but pressing, with a quality of someone pushing hard on a point they consider important. She heard, later, the particular quality of conclusion, the shift when things resolved. She began to understand, in a more granular way, what it meant to hold together 7 packs across a significant territory. It was not a symbolic role. It was an active, daily, ongoing work of maintenance and decision and negotiation, and the kind of judgment that was only possible if you were paying constant attention to many things at once and had developed the ability to hold them all without any one of them collapsing under the weight of the others. She thought about this version of him, the one in the meeting rooms, the one pressing hard on points that mattered, alongside the version she knew, the midnight courtyard, the library corridor, the way he had handed her the letter and asked what she wanted. She was doing what she did, with everything important, approaching it from the sides, building the complete picture before she committed to an interpretation. The picture was becoming complete. Toward the end of the 5th week, Owen Fletcher spoke to her for the 3rd time. She was at the large table in the library, working through a set of accounts of a territorial negotiation from 60 years ago that she had found unexpectedly interesting because of what it revealed about how Blackmore's border positions had been established and why. Owen came in, went to a shelf on the ground floor, retrieved a document, and was leaving when he stopped. He looked at the accounts on the table. "Those are the Hargrove negotiations," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are relevant to the current Northeast situation," he said. "The same 2 families are involved." He paused. There was something working behind his expression, some internal argument being concluded. "There is a parallel document in the administrative archive. Not public. It contains the private correspondence from both sides during the negotiation. The official account does not include it." Another pause. "If you have interest in the full picture." She looked at him steadily. "I would like to see it," she said. He nodded once. "I will arrange access." He moved toward the door. "Owen," she said. He stopped. She chose her words with care. "I know this is not simple," she said. "I am not asking you to pretend it is. I am not asking you to feel anything about the situation that you do not genuinely feel. I am only asking, when it is possible, for what you just gave me. The better book, the fuller picture, that is all." He stood at the door for a moment. "You are direct," he said. "I have found it more efficient than the alternative," she said. Something changed in his face. It was not a large change, but it was real. "The archive opens at 8, he said. "I will leave word with the keeper that you have access." He left. She sat at the table and looked at the Hargrove negotiations and felt something settle, fractionally, inside her. The particular satisfaction of a piece fitting into a picture correctly. Not the end of the picture, a peace. That evening, she found Kalen in his study, which she had been to once before, when he had wanted to show her a map of the territory. She knocked. He called her in. He was at his desk, working through a set of documents with the focused attention of someone deep into something. He put the pen down when she entered. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She said, "Owen Fletcher is coming around." He looked at her with that steady attention. "I know," he said. "You did not rush him." "No. And you trusted that he would get there." "I trusted what I know of him, yes." She looked at the papers on his desk, at the map on the wall behind him, marked with the Blackmore territory and its surrounding packs, with small notations she could not read from where she sat. At the man sitting at the desk, who had been managing something enormous since he was 24 years old, and who had made mistakes, and learned from them, and had built something out of that learning, that she could see evidence of in every room she walked into. She said, "I am starting to understand this place." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you understand about it?" "That it works the way it says it works," she said. "That the difference between this place and the one I came from is not surface. It is structural. It goes all the way down." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "I am not saying that I have decided anything," she said. "I know. But I am saying that I see it. What is here. What you have built. I see it. And I think it is real. And I think it is rare. And I wanted to tell you that I see it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the study window, the evening was settling into the particular darkness of late November, and somewhere in the compound, someone was playing an instrument, something quiet with strings, not for an audience, just for the playing of it. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in exactly the way she had meant it to Clara Bell on the bench, in the full, genuine sense, the one that acknowledges receipt of something important. She stood. She went to the door. She said, "Good night, Kalen." "Good night, Serafina," he said. She walked back to her room through the warm corridor and the compound sounds, and she did not write anything that evening. She did not need to. The thing she would have written was already clear, already fully formed, no longer in need of paper to make it real. She was not the person she had been when she arrived here. Not entirely. Some things had loosened. Some things that had been braced against impact had begun, very carefully, to release. She had not decided anything. This was still true. But the decision was closer than it had been. She was no longer afraid of making it. This was new. This was the thing worth noting. She lay in bed and listened to the distant strings, and she was not afraid. The snow came properly in December, the kind that did not hesitate or apologize, the kind that arrived with the full intention of staying. Serafina had grown up with snow. Ashvale's territory was in a region where winter committed itself, and she had spent enough Decembers there to understand its particular language, the quality of cold that preceded heavy snowfall, the way sound changed when a significant layer had accumulated, the specific silence of very early morning in the middle of a snowstorm, when the world had reduced itself to a quiet so complete it almost had texture. She found, to her surprise, that she loved the snow at Blackmore in a way she had not loved it at Ashvale. This was not about the snow. She understood this intellectually. The snow was the same snow. The difference was in the experience of standing in it, of looking at it through a window, of walking across the courtyard in it, with the frosted stones underfoot, and the cold air in her lungs, and the compound around her full of warmth, and people, and the ordinary sounds of a place that knew what it was. She tried to explain this to Petra during one of their walks, which had evolved from a daily routine into something she genuinely looked forward to, in a way that she had not anticipated, and still found slightly startling. She described the difference between the snow here and the snow there, knowing even as she described it that the description was inadequate. Petra listened. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace even in the cold, her hands in the pockets of a coat that was clearly built for function rather than appearance. "What you are describing," Petra said when Serafina had finished, "is the difference between a place that takes from you and a place that does not." Serafina looked at her. "In Ashvale," Petra continued, "you spent energy constantly, managing how you appeared, how much space you took up, how your presence landed on other people. That expenditure does not stop, even when you are standing in the snow looking at nothing. You are always allocating resources toward survival." She paused. Here you are not doing that. The snow is just snow. The cold is just cold. You can feel it as itself. Serafina walked in silence for a moment. That is exactly it, she said. How do you know that? I have been in this work for a long time, Petra said. I have seen people arrive from difficult places. The process is specific. There is always a point where they stop managing and start simply being, and it is always visible from the outside before it is fully visible from the inside. You can see it in me, Serafina said. Yes. What does it look like? Petra glanced at her. You walk differently than you did when you arrived. You still watch everything. That is not something that goes away quickly, and perhaps it should not go away entirely. It is a useful quality. But you walk without the particular arrangement of someone who is trying to take up the right amount of space. You just walk. Serafina thought about this. She thought about the person who had walked into Blackmore's courtyard 6 weeks ago. The specific physical arrangement of herself, the pulled-in quality, the weight distributed, as though she were always prepared to absorb an impact. She had not been conscious of it. It had been the default setting for so long that consciousness of it had stopped being necessary. I still do it sometimes, she said. Yes, Petra agreed. When something catches you off guard, you close up for a moment and then you open again. She glanced at Serafina again. The difference is how quickly you open again. It used to take longer. They walked on. The snow along the path was packed down by the morning's foot traffic, gray-white and solid. The trees beyond the compound walls were carrying their December weight, branches loaded, the whole landscape simplified into the essential shapes of things. Petra, she said. Yes. What do you think about all of this? About me being here? About, she gestured vaguely, meaning the whole of the situation. Petra was quiet for a few paces, which was her way of giving a question the seriousness it deserved. I think, she said, that Kaylin has been doing this work for a long time, holding this place together, making the decisions, being the person all of this depends on. A pause. I have watched him do it. He does it with everything he has, and doing it with everything you have, constantly, is sustainable only if there is something that is not about the work. Something that is only yours. Another pause. He has not had that. He has had the work, and he has had the people in it, which he values genuinely, and he has had this place, which he has built with great care, but he has not had someone who sees him as a person, rather than as a role. She stopped walking. Serafina stopped with her. They looked out over the field beyond the path, where the snow was unbroken and flat, and extended to the tree line in a wide, even expanse. You see him as a person, Petra said. I have watched you do it. Every time you encounter him, you are looking at him, not the position. Most people cannot do that. Most people look at the Alpha King, and see the Alpha King, and whatever they actually feel about him, is filtered through that title, whether they want it to be or not. She looked at Serafina. You look at him and see Kaylin. Whatever that ends up meaning for the two of you, that quality is rare, and it is exactly what he has needed. Serafina stood in the cold and looked at the unbroken snow and thought about what Petra had just said. She thought about the midnight courtyard. She thought about the way his expression moved through things she was learning to read, the particular shift from his working face to the something lighter that appeared occasionally. She thought about the meeting room sounds she had heard in the corridor, the voice pressing hard on points that mattered, and the voice that answered her questions in the library in the evenings, which was quieter and more interior and entirely different in quality. She had been watching a person. She had been watching all the faces of a person and assembling them into a complete portrait, the way she assembled complete pictures of everything that was important to her, piece by careful piece. The portrait was nearly complete. In the second week of December, Kaylin asked if she would walk the territory with him. Not a full patrol. The territory was too large for a casual walk, but an afternoon along the western boundary, which was the part that bordered the woodland she had crossed on the night she arrived. She said yes. They went on a Saturday, when the weather had cleared to the particular bright cold of a December day that had decided to be cooperative. The sky was a flat, pale blue, and the snow reflected light in a way that made everything slightly luminous, slightly more present than usual. She wore the coat that Petra had found for her in the second week, properly fitted, a dark green, the first item of clothing in years that had been selected with her in mind, rather than being a leftover or a correction. Kaylin walked beside her, not leading. She noted this. They talked as they walked. It was the longest continuous conversation she had had with him, and it moved through more territory than their previous conversations had. Less bounded by the specific purpose of information exchange, more willing to follow its own direction. He told her about the western boundary and why it mattered, not from a leadership perspective, but from a personal one. He had grown up on this side of the compound. He had run this boundary as a child, as a young man in training, as a new leader, trying to understand what he was responsible for. The land had specific memories attached to it, and he shared them with the ease of someone who has sorted through what they want to say, and found that what they want to say is honest. She told him things she had not told anyone in Blackmore. The library at Ashvale and its inadequate collection, the plants on the windowsill, the book organization system that made sense to no one else, the small, quiet ways she had made that narrow room hers over 4 years. She told him about the night she left, the plans she had made over 3 months, the border she had crossed without knowing it, the pull she had felt and followed. He listened with the complete attention she had come to recognize as one of his specific qualities, not the attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the attention of someone who is genuinely taking in what they are hearing and letting it matter to them. What did it feel like? He asked. The pull. She thought about this, wanting to describe it accurately. Like something settling into a correct position, she said. Like I had been slightly misaligned for my entire life, and whatever was pulling was moving me toward the position I was supposed to be in. He was quiet for a moment. The bond works differently for different people, he said. For some it is immediate and overwhelming. For others it is very quiet, and you could almost miss it. He paused. For you it was quiet, but you followed it anyway. I was in a forest in the dark, she said. I had very little to lose. No, he said, and something in his voice was gentle, in a way she had not heard from him before. That is not why you followed it. People with nothing to lose do not always follow things that feel uncertain. Sometimes they do the opposite. They hold on to what they know, because it is all they have. You followed something you could not explain, in the dark, in an unfamiliar place, because some part of you trusted it. She walked with this for a moment. I did not think about it as trust, she said. I thought about it as not wanting to override something that might be important. That is trust, he said. She looked at him. He was looking ahead, at the tree line where the boundary ran, and his profile was clear against the pale blue sky. She looked at him, the way Petra had said she looked at him, at the person, not the title. At the specific face of a specific individual who had been managing something large and important and difficult since he was too young for it, and who had, in the middle of all of that, held a very specific patience for 3 years, because he understood that the situation required it. She said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I would answer any other way, only if I thought the honest answer would harm you, he said, and I cannot think of a scenario where that is true. Is any part of this, she searched for the right framing, is any part of how you have handled this a strategy, to create conditions that make me more likely to agree to the bond? He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned and looked at her directly, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. Yes and no, he said. I thought about what you would need. I thought about your situation, where you had come from, what you had experienced. I arranged things to give you space and safety, because I believed you needed it. He paused. That was not a strategy in the sense of manipulation. It was an attempt to be genuinely considerate of what was true about you. The distinction matters to me. Whether it matters to you is something only you can determine. She looked at him. She thought about everything she had observed in 6 weeks. The structural honesty of the compound, the gathering, Owen Fletcher's careful offering of better resources, Clara Bell on the bench, Ruth in the library, Petra on every walk, the midnight courtyard and the stars. She said, It matters to me. He held her gaze. Something in his expression moved. Good, he said, quietly. The same single word he had said on the bench when she told him she was not leaving. They walked on along the boundary, and the snow was bright under the pale blue sky, and she was thinking about trust in the full sense of the word, not as a decision made once but as a conclusion reached through an accumulation of evidence, piece by careful piece, until the picture is complete and the interpretation is not in doubt. Her picture was nearly complete. She did not say this. She was not ready to say it. But she was walking beside him in the bright December cold, and she was not managing anything. She was not arranging herself. She was not calculating the cost of her presence. She was just walking. And it was, as Petra had said, just that. Ruth told her about the moon marked on a Thursday morning in the third week of December. In the same sidelong way, Petra delivered most of the information that mattered. Not as an announcement, but as something released into the ongoing conversation of a morning, allowed to find its own level. They had been sitting at the large library table, both of them reading, both of them making the small sounds of two people occupied with their separate work, but comfortable enough with each other's presence to make them without thinking. Ruth had been reviewing a document that was clearly administrative in nature, making small notations in the margins with a pen that had seen better decades. Serafina had been working through a text on the development of pack governance structures in the Northern Territories, which was dense but rewarding. Ruth set down her pen, looked at her document, looked at Serafina. "You're coloring," she said. "How did your pack explain it to you?" Serafina looked up. "They did not explain it. They mentioned it as a quality that made me unusual. Omen was the word that got used most often." Ruth made a small sound that was not quite contempt, but was in its neighborhood. "Omen is what you call something when you do not have the older knowledge," Ruth said. "It is the word of people who recognize that something is significant, but cannot account for why, and fill the gap with whichever explanation requires the least study." Serafina put her own book down. She had learned that when Ruth decided to say something in this direct, declarative way, it was worth setting everything else aside. "What is the older knowledge?" she asked. Ruth folded her hands on the table with the precision of someone who has been waiting to have this particular conversation, and has thought about how to begin it. "In the records that predate the current pack system by several generations," she said, "there are consistent accounts of individuals born with the coloring you have. White-haired, pale-eyed, skin without pigment. They appear across regions, across time, with no pattern of family or lineage. They cannot be bred for. They cannot be predicted. They simply arrive." She paused. "In the oldest accounts, they are called moon-marked. The moon-marked appear at significant junctures. They are not omens in the sense of predictions. They are catalysts. Their presence does not announce what will happen. Their presence makes certain things possible that would not be possible without them." Serafina looked at her. Ruth continued. "The moon marked in the oldest records are consistently found in situations of imbalance is not quite the right word. Think of it as a scale that has drifted slightly from center, year by year, without anyone being aware of the drift. The moon-marked arrive in those situations, and the drift corrects. Not dramatically, not through any act of power, through presence and influence, and the specific qualities that tend to accompany the coloring." "What qualities?" Serafina said. Ruth looked at her directly. The accounts described them consistently as clear-sighted. Not in the supernatural sense, in the precise sense. They see things as they are, not as they are presented. They are difficult to deceive, and even more difficult to manage, because the tools most commonly used to manage people, flattery, fear, social pressure, do not work on them in the usual way. She paused. They are also described as having the capacity to see people as complete, rather than as categories. To look at someone and perceive all of it, the complexity, without the usual reduction. Serafina was very still. She was thinking about the 22 years she had spent being called an omen, an abomination, a thing that made events feel unbalanced simply by attending them. She was thinking about what it would mean if the unbalanced thing had never been her at all. "The packs that use the word omen," she said slowly. "They are not wrong that the presence of a moon-marked person coincides with change. They are wrong about the cause." "Precisely," Ruth said. "They attribute the change to the person's presence as a disruption. The older knowledge suggests that the change was already coming, that the situation had already reached the point where correction was necessary, and that the moon-marked arrived because they are drawn to those situations. Not causing the disruption, facilitating the resolution." Serafina sat with this for a long time. She thought about Blackmore, which was a functioning and well-led place. She thought about Kalen, who was not a failing leader, or a broken system in need of rescue. She was not in the habit of forcing a story to fit itself around her. "Not every moon-marked is in a crisis situation," she said. "The accounts would not all be dramatic corrections. Some of them would simply be Completions, Ruth said. Yes, there are accounts of that category also. Situations that were functioning adequately, but were missing something specific. A precision that the moon-marked person carried. Something that made the difference between adequate and fully realized. Serafina looked at the table, at the books on it, at Ruth's pen with its decades of use. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Ruth's expression shifted slightly. It became something more personal, less purely informational. "Because," she said, "you have been sitting in this library for 6 weeks, reading everything you can find about this place and the people in it, and you have been building your understanding of it, piece by piece, with great care, and you deserve to be able to include yourself in that understanding." She paused. "You are not a person who things happen to, Serafina. You are a person who is part of what happens. There is a difference, and you should know it." The library was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, something settled in the walls, the way old stone settles in cold weather. A small, solid sound, the sound of something substantial, making peace with itself. Serafina picked up her pen, set it down again. "The pack that raised me," she said. "They treated the moon marking as something to be managed and contained. They put it in the omen category, and then handled it with the specific care they gave to things they were afraid of." "Yes," Ruth said. "That is the consistent pattern. Packs that do not have the older knowledge encounter a moon-marked person and respond with the available framework, which is insufficiently equipped. The result is," she chose the word carefully, "suppression. Not deliberate cruelty necessarily. Suppression as a response to something not understood." Serafina thought about Hester and the communal den, about the warning she had received at 21 for looking at a beta's mate with too much confidence, about the meals that were timed and the room that looked onto a wall. Not deliberate cruelty necessarily. She could accept this as accurate and still recognize the cost of it. "What I carry," she said. "The clear-sightedness. The quality of seeing people without reducing them. These are not special abilities. They are things I developed because I had to. They are things you developed in conditions that would have destroyed those qualities in most people," Ruth said. "You maintained them. That is the distinction." She left the library after that and walked outside into the cold without a coat, which she did not notice until Petra appeared from somewhere and put one around her shoulders, with the matter-of-fact competence of a person who has dealt with this specific situation before. She walked. She did not notice where she was walking. She was inside something large. She had spent her life being defined by her coloring as a problem. She had spent it understanding her own qualities as survival adaptations, useful, functional, developed out of necessity. She had never, in 22 years, had access to the framework that would have allowed her to understand herself as something other than a person who had survived despite the circumstances of her existence. The older knowledge said, "The circumstances of your existence are part of the point." She did not want to receive this as flattery. She was not built for flattery, and she did not trust it. She turned it over and looked at it from every angle and tried to find the place where it was an exaggeration or a construction. She could not find it. What she found instead was something quieter and more real, the specific resonance of a description that matches the actual shape of a thing. She had been described with many words over the course of her life, and most of them had been wrong, in ways she could feel, but not always articulate. This one landed differently. It did not feel like flattery. It felt like a measurement taken accurately for the first time. She found herself, after a while, at the western boundary. She had walked farther than she usually walked. The path ended here, at a wooden fence marking the territory's edge, and beyond the fence were the trees. The same trees she had crossed through on the night she arrived, identical from this side. She stood at the fence and looked at the trees. She had come out of those trees without knowing where she was, or why she had been pulled there. She had arrived in a clearing, and woken surrounded by wolves, and found nothing she expected, and everything she had not known she was missing. The moon-marked are drawn to situations where their presence makes a certain thing possible that would not be possible without them. She turned this over one more time. She thought about what she brought to this place, not as a designated role, not as a title or a function, as herself, the specific person she had become through 22 years of being the clearest-sighted person in a room full of people invested in not seeing clearly. She thought about the conversations she had had here, with Ruth, with Clara Bell, with Owen Fletcher. Even with Owen Fletcher, who had been working through his difficulty with her presence, and who had nonetheless pointed her toward better books and opened archive access, because the part of him that valued honest inquiry was stronger than the part that found her situation complicated. She thought about Kalen. She thought about Kalen and the way she had been trying to think about him carefully and honestly, stripping away the complicating factors, the bond, the power differential, the strangeness of the circumstances, and looking at what was actually there. What was there was a person she respected, not because of what he represented, or what he controlled, or what he had offered her. Because of what she had seen of him across 6 weeks of close and honest observation, the way he listened, the way he made decisions and accounted for them, the way he sat in a midnight courtyard alone, looking at stars, without performing solitude for anyone. The way he had asked what she wanted when the letter from Ashevale arrived. She had said, once, that she was not saying yes because of the bond. This was still true. She was not saying yes because of the bond. She was working toward something that was entirely her own. She walked back to the compound, through the December cold, and the snow was bright and the sky was clear, and when she came through the gate, Kalen was in the courtyard. He looked at her, and registered the coat and the direction she had come from, and asked, not with alarm, "How far did you go?" "The western fence," she said. "That is a long walk." "I had thinking to do," she said. He looked at her, with that attention that she had learned was not passive but active, the attention of someone taking in information and making something with it. "Ruth told you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." She looked at him. "Did you know she was going to?" "I knew she had been thinking about it for several weeks," he said. "It was her decision to make, not mine." She thought about this, about the consistent approach, the same approach applied to Rory and Owen and Clara Bell, and now Ruth, the same principle of letting people arrive at their own decisions in their own time, the same underlying trust in individuals to know when the moment was right. "Did you know about the moon marked?" she asked, "before I came here?" "Yes," he said. "The older knowledge is part of Blackmore's archive. I have read it." "And you believed it applied to me?" "I believed the evidence I had, which suggested it. I did not tell you, because it was not mine to tell. It is knowledge about you. The right person to tell you was someone you had built enough trust with to receive it from." A pause. "And because I did not want anything about the situation to feel like it was framed to influence your decision about the bond." She stood in the courtyard and looked at the man who had known about the moon marked and had kept it from her deliberately, not to manipulate, but specifically to avoid it. "You are very careful," she said. "I have made enough mistakes to know what carefulness costs when it is absent," he said. She held his gaze. "I am going to make a decision soon," she said. He was very still. "I am not telling you when," she said. "I am telling you it is close, because I think you should know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her room, and she stood at the window that looked onto the courtyard, and she watched the empty space below, and she felt the last of the fear that had been her companion for so long. It had become a kind of furniture, the fear of wanting something and having it taken, of trusting something and finding the foundation was rotted through, of arriving somewhere good and discovering the good was conditional. She felt the last of that specific fear, and she recognized it, and she said goodbye to it. Not because she had decided the fear was irrational. It was not irrational. It had been earned, and it had served her. But she was in a different place now, and the same map did not work here. She stood at the window until the evening light changed, and the courtyard below filled with the small sounds of a place settling into night, and she held the shape of the decision that was coming, and she was not afraid of it. She was ready. They came in the 4th week of December, on a morning when the sky could not make up its mind about what it wanted to do with the cloud cover it had accumulated, and the compound was in the middle of its ordinary day. People in the hall for morning meal, someone working in the courtyard, the distant sound of training from the eastern wing. 6 wolves from Ashevale crossed the Blackmore border at 9 in the morning. Elliot, Kalen's assistant, brought the news to the library, where Serafina was working. He knocked on the doorframe. She had come to appreciate this about Elliot, that he knocked even on open doors, the courtesy of a person who understood the value of not surprising people, and said, simply, that there was a delegation at the main gate, and that Kaylin was asking whether she wished to be informed. She set her book down very carefully. The care was involuntary, her hands doing a thing her body understood before her mind had finished processing what she had just heard. "From Ashvale," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Elliot said. She sat for a moment. Outside the library window, the undecided sky had settled temporarily on a thin, colorless light that made everything outside look like a sketch rather than a finished picture. "Who leads them?" she said. "A male named Darren Holt," Elliot said. He presented himself as the senior beta. She knew Darren Holt. She knew him the way you know people you have been careful around for years, not intimately, not because you chose to, but because circumstances required a detailed working knowledge of someone whose opinions and moods could have direct effects on your life. Darren Holt was Bernard Cross's primary enforcer, the person who translated the Alpha's decisions into consequences for the people below him. He was not stupid. He was not randomly cruel. He was competent at what he did, and what he did was manage situations on behalf of a leadership that preferred its problems handled before they became visible. She understood, the problem Darren Holt had come to handle. She stood up. "Tell Kaylin I wish to attend," she said. "Tell him I wish to be present in the room." Elliot nodded and left, and she stood there for a moment, in the library she had come to think of as partly hers, the second-floor spot with the good light, the philosophy section on the east wall, Ruth's preferred table, with its permanent ring from decades of morning tea, and she did something she had learned here, in this place, from these people. She made a deliberate choice about who she was going to walk into that room as. Not the Serafina who had arrived 6 weeks ago, narrow and carefully arranged, taking up the minimum available space. Not the person who had learned to manage every variable in a room before entering it, who had organized herself in advance around anticipated disapproval. She was going to walk into that room as the person she had spent 6 weeks being. The one who read in the library and walked the western boundary and had conversations that went where they needed to go, and told a beta who had difficulty with her presence that she was not asking him to feel anything he did not genuinely feel. That person. She went downstairs. Kaylin met her in the corridor outside the main hall. He looked at her with the quick, complete attention of someone reading a situation. "You do not have to be in the room," he said. "I can handle this entirely without your presence." "I know," she said. "I want to be there." He looked at her for another moment. "You know Darren Holt," he said. "Yes." "What is his approach?" She thought about this, because the question deserved a real answer. "He is reasonable when he believes the situation calls for reason," she said. "He becomes something else when he believes he is in a position of leverage. He has come here believing he has leverage, because Ashvale has always been able to leverage me. I have always been in a position where I needed to accommodate what they decided." "You are not in that position now," Kaylin said. "I know," she said. "That is why I want to be in the room." He nodded. He held the door to the main hall open for her, and she walked through it. The hall was arranged with the Blackmore delegation on one side of the long central table. Kaylin, flanked by Owen Fletcher and another senior advisor named George Aldridge, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who had the specific quality of someone whose stillness is a form of strength, and the Ashvale delegation on the other. Darren Holt at the center, 5 wolves behind him. Holt was in his human form, mid-40s, with the upright, deliberate posture of a man who has spent his life in proximity to authority, and has developed authority of his own through that proximity. He looked at Serafina when she entered. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalculation. She sat down at the table beside Owen Fletcher, who had come to the meeting himself, which she noted. 3 weeks ago, Owen Fletcher's presence in this room for her benefit would not have been something she would have predicted with confidence. Here he was, in his seat, with the neutral, prepared expression of a man who had made his peace with a situation and was now engaged with it professionally. She noted this and tucked it away. Kaylin sat down last. He was the last to sit, not as theater, but because he was the last to arrange himself, the last to settle, which meant the room did not begin until he was ready, and his readiness was never performed. It simply arrived. "Darren Holt," Kaylin said. Not a greeting, an identification. Alpha King, Holt said. The title was correctly used, which meant Holt had been briefed and had decided that the opening position would be formal respect rather than anything adversarial. You have crossed my border to address a matter related to Seraphina Vale, Kalen said. The Ashvale Pack, Holt said, has an interest in confirming the welfare and circumstances of a pack member who departed without formal process. The language was careful. Welfare, circumstances, the framing of concern rather than claim. Seraphina Vale departed Ashvale of her own choice, Kalen said. She arrived in Blackmore territory and has been resident here as a guest with full rights for 7 weeks. Her welfare is excellent. Her circumstances are her own. Holt looked at Seraphina. We would like to hear this from Seraphina herself, he said. She had been waiting for this. She had known it was coming. She held his gaze, and she thought about the very specific history of her eyes and Darren Holt, and every person in Ashvale who had used her gaze as evidence of something that needed correction. Too direct, too unmanaged, too much confidence for someone of her station. She held it. I left Ashvale voluntarily, she said. I am here voluntarily. I am well. I have everything I need, and more than I had before. She paused, choosing the next words with precision. I have no intention of returning to Ashvale. The room absorbed this. Holt's expression did not change visibly, but something in the quality of his attention shifted. He was recalculating again, more extensively this time. The pack has obligations to its members, he said. When a member departs without formal process, I was not a member of the Ashvale Pack in any meaningful sense, Seraphina said, and she kept her voice entirely level, not cold, not heated, just precise. I was housed there. I was used there. I was managed there. The word member implies a reciprocal relationship that did not exist. She met his gaze steadily. You know this is true. You have always known this is true. The question before you now is whether you are going to continue using the language of obligation when what you mean is ownership, or whether you are going to say what this actually is. Silence. Holt looked at her for a long moment. He was not a dishonest man. She had always known this. He was a man whose honesty operated within the limits set by whoever he was working for, but the capacity for it was present. She was counting on that capacity. The Ashvale Pack, he said, slowly, has an interest in your well-being and in maintaining a respectful relationship with the Blackmore territory. This was a pivot. She recognized it. He was stepping back from the leverage position and into something more sustainable. I appreciate the concern for my well-being, she said. I can assure you it is addressed. A pause. A respectful relationship between Ashvale and Blackmore is Kalen's matter to discuss, not mine. She had effectively handed the conversation to Kalen with one sentence, and she had done it deliberately. She had said her piece. She had said it to the person who needed to hear it, in the room, with the full weight of Blackmore's presence behind her. Further words from her would be surplus. Kalen, beside her, said nothing for a moment. She could feel, without looking at him, the particular quality of his attention. He had been watching her handle this room. The Blackmore territory, he said, directing his attention to Holt, is glad to maintain a civil relationship with Ashvale. We have no outstanding conflicts. We intend none. His voice was even. What I want to be clear about, so that this conversation does not need to happen again, is that Seraphina Vale is under my protection. That protection is not conditional, and it does not have an expiration. Any future communication regarding her from your pack should be directed to her, not to me, because she is not my concern to manage. She is a person who makes her own decisions. Holt looked at Kalen. Something worked behind his expression. Understood, he said, and the word had weight behind it. Not reluctant weight, considered weight. The meeting was over in 15 minutes, which Seraphina found efficient and correct. Holt was courteous in departure. He looked at her once more before he left, and in that look she saw something she had not expected. Not the managing assessment she was used to from him, but something closer to a genuine seeing. A person looking at a situation and updating their picture of it. Take care of yourself, he said to her, and it was, she thought, the first time in their acquaintance that he had said anything to her that was entirely without function. I will, she said. He left with his delegation. The room emptied behind him. Owen Fletcher, walking out, paused beside her and said, quietly, efficiently handled, which was the highest praise she had heard from him, and which she received accordingly. George Aldridge, at the door, turned and gave her a look that contained simple, clean respect. She stood at the end of the long table in the quiet hall, and the undecided sky outside had made its decision while they were in the room. Snow, again, falling in the steady, unhurried way of weather that has nowhere to be, and every reason to continue. Kaylin was beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She looked at the snow through the window. She looked at the empty chairs on the other side of the table. She looked at the room from which Darren Holt had departed with a different understanding of the situation than the one he had arrived with. She looked at her own hands on the table. Still, not arranged, just her hands. "Free," she said. The word landed in the quiet of the room and stayed there, simple and accurate, and not in need of anything added to it. Kaylin looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the snow fell on. She found him 2 evenings after the Asheville delegation left. She had been carrying the decision for longer than she had admitted to herself, and the meeting with Darren Holt had not been the cause of it. It had been the last piece of information she needed, not because it revealed anything she had not already known, but because it showed her who she was now, in relation to what she had been. She had sat across the table from the mechanism of everything that had been wrong about her life for 22 years, and she had not been afraid of it. She had not been managed by it. She had spoken the truth plainly and clearly, and she had been seen, in that room, as a person who had the standing to speak it. She had needed to know she could do that before she made this choice. Now she knew. She found him in his study at the end of the evening, when the compound had moved into its quieter hours, and the corridors had the particular feel of a place in which most of the activity had relocated inward. The light under his door was on. She knocked. "Come in," he said. She went in. He was at his desk, but he was not working. The papers were there, but not in the configuration of active work. More the configuration of someone who has been sitting with their thoughts, and the papers are simply present, without being the focus. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his expression sharpened, became more alert, in the way a person becomes alert when something they have been waiting for appears. He did not say anything. He was giving her the room. She sat in the chair across from his desk. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, and he looked back, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. They had moved past uncomfortable silence several weeks ago. What existed between them now was something she had come to value specifically, the silence of two people who have figured out that they do not need words to fill every moment, that the moments are complete without them. "I have something to say," she said. "I know," he said. She took a breath, not from nerves, though there were some. The particular alertness that comes before doing something important, that is not quite fear but is first cousin to it. This was different. This was the alertness of someone doing something intentional and real, something with weight, and wanting to do it right. "When I left Asheville," she said, "I left because I had done the arithmetic. I had looked at my situation from every direction, and the result was the same from all of them. There was no version of staying that was survivable in the long term, so I left." She paused. "I did not leave toward anything. I was leaving away from something. I did not know that something else existed. I did not have access to the idea that what I was moving toward might be as important as what I was moving away from." He was very still, listening with everything. "I spent 6 weeks here watching this place and the people in it," she said, carefully. "The way I watch everything carefully, because that is what I have learned to do, because it has been necessary. And what I found, piece by piece, was something I did not have a prior framework for." She met his gaze directly. "A place that operates according to what it says it operates according to. People who are what they present themselves to be. A version of authority that is not a mechanism for taking from people. A pause. And you, who are all of those things and more." His expression moved through something. She watched it, the particular movement she had come to know, the shift from the working face to the something underneath it. "I am not saying yes because of the bond," she said. "I want to be very clear about that, because I think you need to hear it clearly. The bond is real. I felt it on the night I walked through the forest. I feel it now, in this room. I am not denying it." She paused. "But a bond is not the same as a choice. A bond tells you that something is significant. It does not tell you what to do about it. What I have been doing for 6 weeks is deciding what to do about it. On my own terms, with my own reasoning. He nodded, once. He understood the distinction. She knew he did. My answer, she said, based on what I know, and what I have seen, and who I have found you to be. My answer is yes. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the December night pressed against the glass. Inside, the fire in the corner had burned down to the kind of steady warmth that does not need tending, that has reached its consistent temperature and will hold it. Kaylin looked at her. For the first time in their acquaintance, for the first time across all the evenings in the courtyard and the afternoons in the corridors and the territorial walk and every conversation they had navigated together, she saw something in his face that was completely unguarded. Not the working face, not the lighter quality that appeared sometimes, not the deliberate calm. Something that had been held in reserve for a very long time, behind all of those, waiting. Relief, and beneath that, something that did not have a word smaller than everything. I have wanted to hear that, he said, and his voice was different in a way she could not fully categorize, quieter and more interior. For 3 years. I know, she said. I am sorry it took time. Do not be, he said. The time was the point. I always understood that. She looked at him. She thought about the man who had sat in a midnight courtyard alone looking at stars, and the man who had managed 7 packs through difficulty and mistake and correction, and the man who had asked her what she wanted when the letter from Ashvale arrived, and the man who had said she could leave at any time, and had meant it. She thought, I see you, all of it, the complexity of it, and I am not reducing any of it. She said this because she had learned here, in this place, that keeping things in her head when they needed to be said was a habit from a time when saying things had costs she could not afford. The cost was different now. I see you, she said, not the role, not what you represent. You, and what I see is someone I want to know more of, for a very long time. He stood up from behind the desk. He crossed the room, and he sat down in the chair beside hers, and he looked at her from that close proximity, which was different from across the desk, closer, more present, the space between them, reduced to something that felt deliberate and important. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When you followed the pull, that night in the forest, if you had known where you were going, if you had known all of this was waiting at the end of it, would you have come? She thought about this honestly. I think, she said slowly, that I would have been more afraid if I had known. I would have been carrying the knowledge of what was at stake, and I would have managed around it the way I managed around everything important. I might have talked myself out of it. She looked at him. I came because I did not know, and I stayed because of what I found when I got here. Which was a place where I could see clearly, she said, without having to manage what I saw in order to survive it. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the corner held its steady warmth. Outside, the night had fully committed to itself. There will be things we have not yet reached, he said. Decisions that will be difficult. Situations we cannot fully anticipate. He said this without apology, as a fact. I will not always handle everything correctly. I know, she said. Neither will I. But you understand what this place is, he said. What I am trying to do here, and why. I have read the records, she said, and the quality of her voice had moved into the lighter register, the one she used with Petra sometimes, with Clara Bell, the one that had room in it for things that were slightly, carefully funny, in considerable depth. Something in his expression did the thing she liked, that genuine, unperformed shift toward the lighter. Ruth said you had gone through the governance archives in the first 3 weeks. Ruth says a great deal of things to you that she tells to no one else, Serafina observed. She is a very direct woman, he said. She told me about the moon marked, Serafina said. He looked at her steadily. How do you feel about that? About that knowledge? She thought about the afternoon in the library. The specific feeling of a description landing accurately for the first time. The feeling of being measured correctly. I feel, she said, like a map of myself that was drawn wrong for 22 years was redrawn correctly. She paused. I am still getting used to the new map. That makes sense, he said. I do not want to carry it as a significance I have to live up to, she said. I want to carry it as information. About what I am, and why certain things about me are the way they are. That is the right way to carry it, he said. They sat beside each other in the quiet of the study, the fire at the corner, the night at the window, the papers on the desk that could wait as long as they needed to wait. After a while, she said, "What happens now, in the practical sense?" He looked at her. Something in the look was warm and precise at the same time, the quality of a person who has been thinking about an answer for longer than the conversation that asked for it. "We take time," he said. "There is no ceremony required immediately. The bond does not operate on a schedule. We take time to simply be in the same place, making the same choices, learning the ordinary things." "The ordinary things," she said. "What you take in your tea," he said. "What you are like on the days when things are difficult. What you find funny. What you cannot tolerate. What you need when you are tired." He paused. The things that the extraordinary version of a story always leaves out, because they do not read as dramatic, but they are the actual content. She looked at him. She thought about the book organization system in her old room that made sense to no one else, the plants on the windowsill that she had not been able to take, the specific quality of silence that she had always sought out in rooms full of noise. "I cannot tolerate people who hedge," she said, "who say what they mean in the longest possible way that still allows them to take it back later." "I know," he said. "I noticed. And I take my tea without anything in it." "I will remember that," he said. "What can you not tolerate?" she said. He thought about this, with the same seriousness he brought to most things. Decisions made by people who are more concerned with how the decision looks than with what it actually accomplishes, he said. "It produces terrible outcomes and takes twice as long." A pause. "And poorly organized bookshelves. It is irrational, I am aware." She looked at him. "My system is entirely logical," she said. "It is simply not alphabetical." "What is it?" "Thematic," she said. "By what the books are actually about, rather than who wrote them, so that books that are in conversation with each other are in proximity." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him consider this. "That is better than alphabetical," he said. "I know," she said. They sat in the study until the fire had burned down, and the night had deepened, and from somewhere in the compound came the sound of someone making their last round of the building, the steady footsteps of a person doing a quiet job at the end of a day, the sound of the place taking care of itself. She stood to go. He stood with her. At the door, she turned. "I will see you tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. Not a ceremony, not a declaration. The specific, solid, ordinary thing. She went to her room, and she looked out the window at the courtyard, at the fire pit, at the snow on the stones, at the walls of a place she had been brought to by something she could not explain, and had stayed in because of something she could. She had arrived with nothing, and the clothes she was wearing. She was leaving that room with a territory, with people, with a library and a woman named Ruth, and a warrior named Petra, and a 17-year-old named Clara Bell, and an advisor named Owen, who found better books when it mattered. With a place she understood down to its structure, all the way through. With a person she had chosen freely, with her whole picture assembled, with her eyes open. She stood at the window until the snow stopped falling, and the clouds cleared and the stars appeared, and she looked at them, and she thought of the midnight courtyard, and she smiled, not the careful, managed expression she had always calibrated for public use, but the real one, the one with no audience, the one that was just hers. She was home. The morning of the ceremony arrived the way mornings do, when you have not been sleeping heavily, gradually, with full awareness, the dark thinning at the window, rather than disappearing all at once, the world coming back in stages, rather than announcing itself with the sudden clarity of a well-rested awakening. Serafina had been awake since before the light, not from anxiety, from the specific alertness of someone who is moving toward something real, and whose body understands this before the day has technically begun. She had lain in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and she had gone through it, not rehearsing, not managing, just holding the shape of the day ahead and feeling its weight in a way she found, to her own surprise, comfortable. She had asked for a small gathering. She had asked for this specific, and Kalen had not argued it, had not suggested something larger was more appropriate to the occasion, had simply said, "What do you want?" which she had learned was not a diplomatic gesture with him, but an actual question, expecting an actual answer. What she wanted was the people who had made the difference, the ones who had, in their own ways and at their own paces, done the thing that had made this possible. Not the bond, not the circumstance, but the experience of being in this place and finding it to be what it said it was. Petra, Ruth, Clara Bell, Owen Fletcher, who had gotten there at his own pace and arrived fully. George Aldridge, who had been in the room when Darren Holt came and had stood as a quiet wall of consideration. Rory, who had seen something worth defending before it was easy to defend it. Elliot, who knocked on open doors and handled things with the care of someone who understood that care was not a small thing. And the clearing. She had asked for the ceremony to happen in the clearing, where she had woken on that November morning. She could not have explained this to anyone's complete satisfaction, but she had not needed to, because when she told Kaylin, he had not asked her to explain it. He had only said, "Yes, of course," as though it were the obvious choice, as though he might have suggested it himself. The clearing was a 20-minute walk from the compound. They went in the morning, when the December light was doing what December light did at its best, flat and even, without the shadows and angles of other seasons, making the world look simplified in a way that felt like clarity, rather than reduction. The snow had been heavy the previous night, and the path was white and unbroken, except for the tracks they were making now. She walked beside Petra, who had her coat and her silence, the particular companionable quiet of someone who knows when words are not what the moment requires. Behind them, the others, their footsteps making the snow announce them to the empty morning. Kaylin walked ahead. He did not look back. He had said, when they set out, that the walk was hers, that he would be at the clearing when she arrived, and then he had gone ahead with the particular stride of someone who knows the way by memory and is moving through it with intention. She watched his back as they walked. She thought about the first time she had followed that back, through the gap in the tree line, into the compound, into the courtyard and through the gate, and into all of this. She had followed then, because he had not checked to see if she was following, and that absence of surveillance had been the most remarkable thing she had encountered in that entire extraordinary morning. He still did not check. He still walked ahead without looking back, and she still followed, but the meaning of the following had changed entirely. They came through the tree line into the clearing. The clearing was different in December snow than it had been in November frost, but the essential thing was the same. The wide circle of grass, now white, the ring of dark trees, the sky above. The sky was doing what it had been doing when she woke here, that pewter and cloud arrangement, neither committed to sun nor to storm. Kaylin was standing at the center. He had gotten there ahead of them, and he was standing in the snow in the middle of the clearing, and he was looking at the sky, which she recognized as his version of the midnight courtyard, the specific stillness of a person whose thoughts have reached a place where they need the open air around them to fully form. He heard them come through the tree line, and he looked. He looked at her, across the clearing. She crossed it. She walked through the snow in the morning light, and she crossed the clearing, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked at his face, the full, complete, complicated face of a person she had assembled into a whole picture over 8 weeks of paying honest attention, and she felt the particular quality of standing in a place you have chosen freely with your whole self. She had a thing to say. She had not planned the words exactly. She had thought about the approach and the honesty of it, and she had trusted herself to find the right language when the moment arrived, because she had always been, at her core, a person with good access to the right language when it mattered. 8 weeks ago, she said, I woke up in this clearing, and I did not know where I was, or why I was here. I did not know your name. I did not know this place. I had come from a situation that had taught me very specific things about what the world was, and how it worked, and what I could expect from it. She looked at him steadily. Everything I had been taught was wrong. Not completely wrong. There were reasons I learned what I learned, and they were real reasons. But the map I had was the map of one specific place, and I had been applying it to the entire world, and the map was wrong. He listened with everything. I found a different world here, she said. One where the map I had did not apply, and I did not know what to do with that at first, because having the wrong map and knowing it still feel very similar from the inside. There is still the disorientation, still the reaching for familiar landmarks, and finding they are not there. She paused. What made the difference was the people. Who you are. Who they are. She glanced briefly at the circle around them. These specific people who had been her education. What you showed me, not told me, showed me, was that the world I had mapped was not the only world. That a different kind of place was possible and real, and not a story people told to make difficult circumstances easier to tolerate. A crow landed at the edge of the clearing, black against the white snow, and regarded them with its specific corvid attention for a moment before lifting off again. "I am choosing this," she said, "with complete information and complete awareness. Not because something is pulling me toward it that I cannot resist. Not because it is the best available option. Because I know what this is, and I know what you are, and I want it. All of it. The ordinary version, the tea and the arguments about bookshelves and the decisions that will be difficult, and the extraordinary version, which is simply this." She looked at him directly. "Being here. Being seen. Being in a place that sees me back." Kaelin looked at her. She had seen his face in many configurations now. She had seen the working face, and the meeting face, and the midnight courtyard face, and the brief, unperformed lightness that appeared in his expression, sometimes without announcement. She had seen the face he wore when he was making a decision he knew would cost something, and was making it anyway. She had seen his face in the corridor at the end of long days, and in the library, when she asked him something he found worth thinking about. What she saw now was something that contained all of those, and was also different from all of them. The specific face of a person who has finally arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a very long time, and has found it to be exactly what they hoped it would be. And this has undone them slightly, in a way they are entirely at peace with. He said, "I have known your name for 3 years. I have known your location, and your circumstances, and the outline of your life, and I have known nothing true about you. Because knowing the facts of a person is not the same as knowing the person, and I had only the facts." He looked at her with everything visible. "In 8 weeks, I have learned more of who you actually are than 3 years of facts ever told me. And what I have learned is that every piece of it, the careful watching, the honest language, the way you read a room from the doorway, the book system that is thematic rather than alphabetical, all of it is someone I want to be in a room with. All of it." He reached out and took her hands. She let him. His hands were warm, which struck her as significant in a way she could not fully articulate. In the December cold of the clearing, his hands were warm. She held them, and she felt the full present tense reality of the moment. The snow under her feet, the circle of people around them, the trees, the pewter sky, the crow somewhere in the distance making its dry announcement. This clearing, this place where she had woken not knowing where she was. The center of the map. "I will say something simple," Kaelin said, and his voice was quiet, only for her, or as only for her as something can be, in a small circle of people who love you. "I will be honest with you. I will be consistent. I will not always be right, but I will always tell you when I was wrong. I will see you as the person you are, rather than the category you arrived in, and I will never, in whatever time we have, give you cause to question whether this place is safe." He looked at her hands in his. "That is all," she said. "That is everything." She said it because it was true. Not the sweeping declaration, not the volume. The specific, quiet, real things. Honesty, consistency, the willingness to be wrong about something and say so. The promise of safety given by someone whose safety was structural rather than conditional. That was everything. That was the whole of what she had spent 22 years without, and 8 weeks learning to believe was possible. She tightened her hands around his. "I will be difficult sometimes," she said. "Not unreasonably, but I watch things carefully, and I have strong opinions about what I see, and I do not smooth them over." "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." "I will read for very long stretches without surfacing," she said. "I have a large library," he said. "I will reorganize your study," she said, thematically. Something moved in his expression, that genuine, unperformed shift, the lightness. "I will argue it at the time," he said, "and probably concede afterward." "Yes," she said. "You will." Around them, in the circle, the people laughed. Not politely. Genuinely. The specific warmth of people who have been waiting for this, and are glad it is here, and are not trying to hide that they are glad. Petra, who did not laugh easily, was laughing. Ruth, who held her cup of something warm she had carried from the compound, and who had been standing with the precise posture of someone attending an important occasion, was smiling, in the way people smile when something resolves correctly, not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of a thing arriving at the place it was always heading. Clara Bell, standing beside Rory, had the bright, quick energy of someone who is genuinely happy and is not organizing that happiness into anything more considered than itself. Owen Fletcher, at the edge of the circle, had his hands in his pockets and an expression she had never seen on him before. Open, uncalculated, present. He caught her eye. He nodded. One clean, complete acknowledgement. She nodded back. The bond settled between her and Kaylin like something coming into its final position. Not with drama, not with the overwhelming quality she had read about in the old texts, but with the specific quality of something that had been slightly misaligned for a very long time, finally reaching the place it was made for. Quiet, solid, the sound of a key turning in a lock that fits. She had felt a version of this in the forest, on the night she followed the pull. This was the completed version, the actual thing, rather than the approach to it. She looked at the man holding her hands. She thought, I know you. Not completely. She would spend years learning the rest of it, and the rest of it would be the actual content of everything. But she knew the essential shape of him, the things that mattered, the structure of what he was. She thought, I am known. Not completely either, but the beginning of it, the honest beginning, which was more than she had had before in any room she had ever occupied. The ceremony, such as it was complete. They walked back to the compound through the December morning, the same path, the same snow, the same trees, and the sounds of the gathering moved around them. Conversation, the crunch of footsteps, Clara Bell saying something to Rory that made him laugh, Petra walking with her characteristic steadiness, Ruth with her cup. The compound received them the way it received everything, with the ordinary warmth of a place that knows what it is, and does not need the occasion to be larger than it is, to give it its proper weight. In the record that Elliot wrote afterward, in his precise administrative hand, the entry was simple. Bond ceremony. Serafina Vale and Kaylin Morrow, conducted in the Western Clearing. All present witnesses acknowledged. Bond confirmed. Underneath this, in a different hand, Kaylin's, added after the formal entry had been completed, were 4 words. She came here herself. He had written this, and let it stand as the truest thing about the whole of it, the thing that mattered most, the thing that made everything else possible, the thing that no one who had known her story from the outside would have been able to fully understand, unless they had been in the clearing on that November morning, when the wolves were watching, and the sky was gray, and a white-haired woman opened her eyes. She had come here herself, not pulled, not pushed, not managed into it or arranged into it, or left with no other option. She had followed something she could not explain in the dark, through unfamiliar territory, alone, and she had arrived. And she had been found, and she had chosen to stay. In the library, on the 2nd floor, in the thematic philosophy section, the books she had been reading when Elliot knocked on the door with news of a delegation from Ashvale sat in their original positions on the shelf. She had put them down in the middle of a line of thought and had not gone back to them. She went back the day after the ceremony. She found her place. She read. The world outside the library windows was December, and cold and white, and the fire in the courtyard was going, and someone was crossing the stones toward the main building, and a dog of medium enthusiastic breed was following at speed, and somewhere in the compound, Kaylin was in a meeting that would run until mid-afternoon, and Petra was in the eastern wing, and Ruth was probably at her own table on the ground floor, and Clara Bell was probably doing whatever Clara Bell did on Tuesday mornings. And Serafina Vale, who had been born in the wrong place to parents who could not keep her, who had grown up, narrowed down to the minimum version of herself, who had crossed a border in the dark following something she could not name, who had woken surrounded by wolves and walked into a life she had not known was possible. Serafina Vale was in the library. Reading. Home.